There is a shape cut into the chalk hillside of Oxfordshire that is so old nobody alive knows what it means. It stretches across the ground in a long, sweeping, impossible line. A horse, maybe, or something that has never been a horse at all. Something older than the word for horse in any language spoken on that island today. The people who carved it left no explanation. They left no name for themselves. They left no account of the year it was made, no record of the ceremony, no inscription in stone to say why this particular hill, why this particular shape, why the chalk had to be cut exactly this deep and no deeper. They simply made it and walked away into a silence that has never fully broken. That is Britain's Iron Age. 700 years of human life on an island that was, by any measure, thriving. 700 years of settlements and hill forts and trade and metalwork and religion and war and birth and death and everything in between. 700 years during which the people of Britain built some of the most sophisticated fortifications in the ancient world, forged iron tools of astonishing precision, navigated the waters of the English Channel and the North Sea and the Irish Sea with enough confidence to establish trade networks reaching from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. 700 years of people who were, by every archaeological measure we have, intelligent, organized, spiritually serious, and deeply embedded in the landscape they lived in, and they left almost no written record of themselves. Almost none. A handful of coins with names on them that we can barely read. A few inscriptions in a script borrowed from somewhere else. The observations of outsiders who saw them briefly and wrote about them, with the kind of distortion you get when someone is recording a people they have already decided to misunderstand. That is the sum of what the Iron Age British left us in words. Everything else we know we have pulled from the ground with trowels and brushes and ground-penetrating radar. We have inferred it from the bones of their animals and the shape of their granaries and the angle at which they buried their dead. The silence is the most interesting thing about them. Not because silence means nothing happened. Silence means something happened that nobody wrote down. And in the case of Iron Age Britain, the silence stretches from roughly 800 years before the Common Era to 43 in the Common Era, when the Roman army crossed the Channel and brought with them, among other things, the habit of recording everything. What they found when they arrived was not a blank canvas. What they found was a society of extraordinary complexity that had been building, changing, and adapting for 7 centuries, without ever feeling the need to leave written testimony of itself. The Romans looked at it and were impressed. And then they wrote about it in Latin, which means that almost everything we think we know about Iron Age Britain is filtered through the minds of people who conquered it and therefore had very specific reasons to see it in particular ways. This is the story of those 7 centuries, of the people who lived in hill forts on ridgelines and looked out over a landscape they had shaped as deliberately as any civilization that kept records, of the metalworkers whose art reached levels of technical sophistication that still puzzle researchers today, of the religious practices so vivid and so strange that the Romans, who had seen most of the ancient world, were disturbed enough to write about them at length, of the trade routes that brought glass and wine and amber and tin across distances that should have been impossible without the infrastructure we associate with literate, bureaucratic societies, of the society that was there, fully formed and fully human, before anyone came along to write it down. You are about to spend the next several hours inside a silence, and the silence, once you learn to listen to it, is extraordinarily loud. If you are watching this late at night, or lying in the dark with the screen dimmed, or letting the words carry you somewhere quieter than the day was, then you are in exactly the right place. These videos exist for exactly this kind of night. History is strange and deep and full of people who never expected to be remembered, and there is something about the dark and the quiet that makes their voices easier to hear. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Before we go any further into the Iron Age, we need to understand what Britain looked like when it began. Because the island that entered the Iron Age, around 800 BCE, was not starting from nothing. It was not a wild, untouched place waiting to be settled. It was already ancient in human terms, already layered with thousands of years of habitation and monument and memory. The people who were living in Britain in 800 BCE were the descendants of people who had been living there for at least 4,000 years before that. They had built Stonehenge and the other great stone monuments of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. They had cleared the forests and established farming settlements. They had developed a Bronze Age culture sophisticated enough to produce the exquisite metalwork you can still see in museums today, swords and shields and ornaments of extraordinary beauty and technical refinement. They had built burial mounds that still mark the ridgelines of the English countryside. They were not newcomers. They were not beginners. They were a people with deep roots in a landscape they had been shaping and interpreting and arguing over for millennia. What changed around 800 BCE was the metal. Bronze had dominated the previous millennium and a half. It required tin and copper, which had to be traded across significant distances, and it had shaped British society in particular ways, creating networks of exchange that reached from Cornish tin mines to the Baltic coast. Iron was different. Iron was everywhere. You did not need to control specific trade routes to get it. You could smelt it from bog iron if you had to. You could find it in riverbanks and marshes. Iron democratized metalworking in a way that bronze never had. And iron, when properly worked, was harder, sharper, more durable than bronze. A good iron blade was a better blade. An iron plowshare cut deeper. Iron nails held timber together more firmly than anything Bronze Age builders had available. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age in Britain was not sudden. It was gradual, stretching over several generations as ironworking knowledge spread across the population, and bronze slowly became the material of ceremony rather than a utility. Swords made of bronze were still being deposited in rivers and lakes, long after iron had become the practical metal of choice. The ritual life of the Bronze Age continued to echo into the Iron Age in ways that archaeologists are still tracing, but the arrival of iron changed the material possibilities of life in Britain in ways that had deep consequences for everything else, for agriculture, for warfare, for the organization of communities, for the relationship between the island and the wider world. The world it was entering relationship with was changing dramatically. Across Europe, the great cultural fluorescence we associate with the Hallstatt and Latène traditions was transforming how people lived, fought, made objects, and buried their dead. These were not nation-states in any modern sense. They were networks of related but distinct communities, sharing artistic traditions and religious ideas and trading relationships across an enormous geographic area. The British Isles were part of this network, not a peripheral backwater watching developments on the continent from a distance. An active participant, importing and adapting and contributing in ways that we are only beginning to fully understand. The archaeology of the earliest British Iron Age shows a society in the process of reorganization. The hillforts that would become one of the defining features of the period were beginning to appear. These were not simple refuges from danger. They were complex engineered structures requiring extraordinary amounts of coordinated labor to build, with multiple defensive circuits and elaborate gateways and internal arrangements that suggest permanent occupation and sophisticated social organization rather than emergency retreats. Some of them were enormous by any standard of the ancient world. Maiden Castle in Dorset covers an area of 47 acres. Danebury in Hampshire was occupied for 5 centuries. These were not campsites. These were cities, or the closest thing to cities that Iron Age Britain produced. And they were built and maintained and eventually abandoned by people whose names we do not know and whose own account of their lives we do not have. That is the fundamental strangeness of the Iron Age in Britain. Not that it was primitive or simple. The archaeology makes clear it was neither. The strangeness is the silence. The absence of self-documentation in a society that was otherwise remarkably organized and capable and connected to the literate world around it. Because by the Middle Iron Age, the Greek and Phoenician and eventually Roman worlds that surrounded Britain were writing things down constantly. They were keeping accounts, recording histories, writing philosophy and poetry and administrative documents. The Mediterranean world was awash in text, and Britain, which was trading with that world and aware of it and in many ways engaged with it, chose not to write things down in any form that has survived. We do not know if they had a reason for this. We do not know if it was a philosophical choice or a practical one, or simply a cultural tradition that never developed in that direction. What we know is the result: 7 centuries of human experience on one of the most important islands in the ancient world, and almost no words. Let us start with what they built. Because building is itself a form of language, and the Iron Age British were extraordinarily eloquent in stone and earth and timber. The hill fort is the most visible monument of the British Iron Age. There are over 3,000 of them in England, Wales, and Scotland. They cluster on ridgelines and promontories, on hills that look out over valleys and coastlines, in positions that combine military advantage with visibility in ways that suggest their builders were thinking about being seen as much as about seeing. A hill fort on a prominent ridge is a statement. It says, "We are here. We have the labor to build this and the organization to maintain it. We control this landscape." Whatever else the hill forts were, which was many things, they were also declarations. The earliest hill forts in Britain date to around 1000 BCE, which places them in the Late Bronze Age rather than the Iron Age proper. This is important because it means the tradition of building enclosed settlements on high ground predates the arrival of iron technology. The Iron Age did not invent the hill fort. It inherited it, and then it elaborated it on a scale that has no parallel in earlier British prehistory. The great hill forts of the Middle Iron Age, the ones built and occupied from roughly 400 to 100 BCE, represent an investment of human effort that is almost incomprehensible to count. Millions of person-days of labor, thousands of tons of earth moved and stone quarried and timber felled and shaped. Communities sustained over generations in the act of constructing and then perpetually maintaining these extraordinary works. Maiden Castle is the place to begin if you want to understand what the Iron Age hill forts became. It sits on a natural ridge near what is now the town of Dorchester in Dorset, and its outer defensive works run for nearly 3 kilometres around a perimeter that encloses enough space to house thousands of people. The defences are not a single bank and ditch. They are multiple concentric circuits, each one elaborating on the last, with gateways of such complexity that approaching the interior from outside would have required navigating a series of overlapping enclosures, each one offering the defenders multiple angles of attack on anyone trying to force entry. The engineers who designed these gateways understood things about the geometry of attack and defense that would not be formally theorized until centuries later in military literature that neither they nor anyone they knew could read. They had arrived at their solutions empirically, through trial and modification over many generations, and the result was a series of defensive works that the Roman army, when it arrived in 43 AD under the future Emperor Vespasian, apparently found challenging enough that the battle for Maiden Castle left archaeological traces of genuine violence. Slingstones in massive quantities. Bodies with spearheads still embedded in their bones. Evidence of a real fight, not a symbolic surrender. But Maiden Castle was not only a military installation, it was a town. Inside those extraordinary defences, there were streets and buildings and storage pits and craft production areas and evidence of a domestic life of considerable complexity. People kept animals there and processed grain and worked iron and made pottery and raised children and buried their dead and did everything that people in settlements do. The boundary between the military and the civilian that we might impose on it today would have made no sense to them. The hill fort was where they lived. The defences were part of where they lived, as natural a feature of their settlement as the walls of any medieval town would be to its inhabitants. The organisation required to build and maintain a place like Maiden Castle tells us something important about Iron Age society that the silence of the written record obscures. These were not simple chiefdoms where a single strong individual could command labour by force of personality. The sustained effort required to construct and repeatedly elaborate the defences of Maiden Castle over several centuries implies institutional structures capable of planning across generations, accumulating resources over long periods, and mobilizing large numbers of people for non-agricultural work at times when agricultural demands permitted. This is the kind of organization we associate with states, or at least with complex chiefdoms of a very sophisticated kind. We do not know what those institutions looked like from the inside. We have no constitutions or law codes or administrative records. We have the hillforts themselves, which are the physical evidence that the institutions existed, and we have a handful of observations by outsiders who visited or heard about Britain during this period, and whose accounts, for all their distortions and limitations, give us occasional glimpses of how Iron Age British society organized itself. The most important of these observers is Julius Caesar, who crossed the Channel twice in 55 and 54 BCE, and who wrote about what he found in his account of the Gallic Wars. Caesar was not an ethnographer, he was a general and a politician, and he wrote about Britain to serve political purposes back in Rome, to establish his credentials as a conqueror of distant and exotic peoples. His account of Britain is shaped by those purposes in ways that make it unreliable in many respects. But he is also an intelligent and observant man who spent time in Britain, and some of what he says corresponds to what the archaeology tells us in ways that suggest he was at least sometimes describing something real. Caesar mentions a system of governance by kings, some of whom controlled single territories and some of whom exercised authority over coalitions of neighboring tribes. He mentions a priestly class, the Druids, whose authority cut across political boundaries and who were responsible for education, religious practice, legal judgment, and the preservation of tradition. He mentions a warrior aristocracy whose status was displayed through warfare, feasting, and the ownership of iron weapons and horse-drawn chariots. He mentions a broader population of farmers and craftspeople who worked the land and produced the goods that supported the elite above them. This is not a simple picture. It is a picture of a stratified society with multiple interacting layers of authority, religious, political, military, whose relationships to each other were presumably complex and contested in the way that relationships between competing sources of power always are. It is a picture that makes sense of the archaeology of the hillforts, which shows evidence of both elite occupation and a much broader population sharing the same defended space, and of the extraordinary concentration of resources represented by the construction of those defences. But it is Caesar's picture, not the Iron Age British people's picture of themselves, and Caesar's picture is not neutral. It is the picture of a conqueror describing the people he has conquered, filtered through assumptions about civilization and barbarity that tell us at least as much about Rome as they do about Britain. The Druids are a perfect example of this problem. Caesar's account of the Druids is the most detailed ancient description we have of an Iron Age British institution. He tells us they were the intellectual class of Celtic society across Britain and Gaul, that they presided over religious ceremonies, that they taught the young men of noble families a process of education that could last 20 years, that they held knowledge that was never written down but was instead committed to memory in the form of thousands of lines of verse, that they settled disputes between tribes and individuals, and that their decisions were binding in a way that political authority could not override, that they believed in the transmigration of souls between lives, a doctrine Caesar connects to their lack of fear in battle. This is a fascinating portrait. It is also, almost certainly, incomplete and distorted in ways we cannot fully identify. Caesar's Druids are interesting to Caesar, partly because they correspond to categories he already has: philosopher, priest, judge, poet. He is translating an institution he does not fully understand into terms that make sense to a Roman reader. What the Druids actually did, how their authority worked in practice, what the relationship between Druidic and political power looked like from the inside, what the thousands of lines of memorized verse actually contained, all of this is lost. The Druids did not write their knowledge down, reportedly as a matter of principle, and therefore we have the Roman description of the outside of the institution, and nothing from within. The same is true of almost everything else about Iron Age Britain. We have the outside view and the ground, in the hands of good archaeologists, has turned out to be astonishingly informative. One of the things the ground tells us most clearly is that Iron Age Britain was not one thing. The term Iron Age covers 700 years and an entire island, and the diversity within it is enormous. The society that occupied Maiden Castle in Dorset at the height of its development was not the same as the society building the Brocks of northern Scotland at the same time. The communities of the Thames Valley were not the same as the communities of the Welsh uplands. The people of the Yorkshire Wolds buried their dead in a way that was distinctively their own, with wheeled vehicles, with joints of pork, in postures that suggest very specific beliefs about the afterlife that are not visible in the burial practices of communities 100 miles to the south. This diversity is itself a kind of evidence. It tells us that Iron Age Britain was not a single culture imposed uniformly across an island. It was a mosaic of communities that shared broad material traditions, the use of iron, certain ceramic styles, certain artistic vocabularies, while maintaining local identities that were apparently strong enough to produce distinct regional practices in the most culturally significant activities of human life: burial, religious ceremony, the construction of settlements. The regional diversity of Iron Age Britain is something that the written sources, such as they are, do almost nothing to capture. Caesar writes about tribes and their territories as if the political map of Britain was the most important thing about it. The archaeology suggests that the most important differences between Iron Age communities might have had much less to do with political boundaries than with long-established local traditions of practice that persisted across whatever changes in political organization were happening above them. Understanding this requires spending some time in the landscape itself, because the landscape is where the Iron Age British left their clearest testimony. The landscape of Iron Age Britain was not the landscape of Britain today. This sounds obvious, but the implications are worth sitting with. The island in 800 BCE was considerably more forested than it is now, and considerably wetter in its lowland areas. The fens of East Anglia that were drained in the 17th century to create some of England's most productive farmland were in the Iron Age a vast complex wetland environment, threaded with rivers and seasonally flooded meadows and stands of reed and alder and willow. The Somerset levels were similarly waterlogged, a world of islands rising from marsh, connected by causeways of timber and brushwood that required continuous maintenance to remain passable. These wetland environments were not obstacles to Iron Age life. They were resources. The fens provided fish and wildfowl and reeds for thatching and peat for fuel and a variety of plant foods that supplemented the diet of communities living on their edges. The rivers and streams that threaded through them were highways, allowing movement and trade in a landscape where overland travel through dense forest was slow and difficult. The timber trackways of the Somerset levels, some of which date to the Bronze Age and were maintained and rebuilt through much of the Iron Age, are among the most striking examples of sustained communal infrastructure in prehistoric Britain. Kilometers of carefully laid wooden road crossing ground that would otherwise have been impassable. But Iron Age people also cleared forest on a massive scale. The great deforestation of Britain, which had begun in the Neolithic when the first farmers arrived with their axes and their animals, continued through the Bronze Age and accelerated dramatically in the Iron Age as iron tools made tree felling faster and the growing population needed more agricultural land. By the Middle Iron Age, large areas of southern and eastern England that had been forested 1,000 years earlier were open farmland, and the ecological transformation of the British landscape was well advanced. The agriculture that replaced the forest was sophisticated. Iron Age farmers grew emmer wheat and spelt wheat and hulled barley and rye and oats, rotating crops through small rectangular fields whose boundaries you can still trace as faint earthworks in aerial photographs of the English countryside. They kept cattle and sheep and pigs and horses, managing their herds with a complexity that required understandings of animal husbandry that has left clear traces in the bone assemblages from Iron Age sites. They stored their surplus grain in large pits cut into the chalk or limestone subsoil, where the sealed environment prevented germination and kept grain viable for months, or in above-ground granaries raised on posts to keep vermin out. They built the kind of agricultural infrastructure, field systems, droveways, stock enclosures, hay meadows, that implies both security of tenure and planning across multiple growing seasons. This is not the agriculture of a desperate, hand-to-mouth existence. The evidence from sites like Danebury, where the contents of hundreds of storage pits have been carefully analysed, suggests that Iron Age communities were producing significant surpluses above what immediate consumption required. That surplus is what made everything else possible. The hillforts, which required large numbers of people working on construction during the agricultural off-seasons, the specialist craftspeople, smiths and potters and weavers and woodworkers, who were not primarily farming, the elite who consumed without producing, the religious specialists whose time was given over to ceremony and teaching and the maintenance of tradition. Surplus is the foundation of social complexity, and Iron Age Britain was producing it. The metalwork is where the silence of the written record most dramatically fails to prepare you for what the archaeology actually shows. Because if you approach Iron Age Britain through the filter of Roman or Greek literary sources, you encounter a characterization of the island's inhabitants as brave but barbaric, fierce in battle but lacking in the refinements of civilization. And then you look at the objects they made, and the characterization falls apart entirely. The Iron Age in Britain produced some of the most technically and aesthetically sophisticated metalwork in the ancient world. Not sophisticated in spite of being made without writing, sophisticated on its own terms, by standards that the objects themselves set, and that any observer, regardless of cultural background, can recognize as the product of minds of the highest order. The Battersea Shield, now in the British Museum, was found in the Thames in the 19th century and dates to somewhere between 350 and 50 BCE. It is made of bronze, decorated with enamel, in swirling curvilinear patterns of extraordinary intricacy. It was never a practical shield. The metal is too thin, the structure too elaborate for combat use. It was made to be seen, to be carried in procession, or displayed in ceremony, or deposited in the river as an offering. And it was made by someone whose understanding of the visual grammar of Celtic art was complete, who could work at the finest scale with materials of absolute purity, who was thinking not just about the surface of the object, but about how the patterns would move and shimmer in firelight, and how the enamel would catch the eye at different angles. The Waterloo helmet, found in the same river near the same bridge, is equally extraordinary. It is the only complete Iron Age ceremonial helmet found in Britain, and it was made by someone who understood metal in a way that modern metallurgists find impressive. The bronze is cast and hammered to a thinness that required extraordinary skill to achieve without cracking. The horns that project from the top are structural elements as well as decorative ones, strengthening the hollow dome of the helmet while simultaneously making it unmistakable at a distance. This was a helmet designed to be seen, like the shield, to make the person wearing it visible and recognizable from across a crowd or a battlefield. To say, I am here, I am important, I have the resources to commission and own this extraordinary thing. These are not the products of a primitive culture. They are the products of a culture with highly developed aesthetic traditions, significant craft specialization, a patronage system capable of supporting the time and skill required to make objects of this quality, and a body of symbolic and iconographic knowledge shared between maker and audience that allowed the objects to mean things beyond their surface appearance. The question of what they meant is one of the most frustrating aspects of the silence. The curvilinear patterns of Celtic art, the interlocking spirals and trumpet curves and stylized animal forms, are clearly a visual language. They appear on objects across a vast geographic range, from Ireland to the Danube, and they maintain a consistency of vocabulary that suggests a shared understanding of what the elements mean and how they can be combined. But what they mean specifically, what the individual motifs signified to the people who made and used them, is not recorded anywhere. We have the visual text without the dictionary. Scholars have proposed various interpretations that the swirling forms represent natural phenomena, water, wind, flame, rendered in a stylized way that captures their essential movement rather than their surface appearance, that they represent the boundaries between visible and invisible worlds, the places where the ordinary and the sacred interpenetrate, that they are cosmological diagrams encoding beliefs about the structure of reality that were also expressed in the oral traditions that have not survived, that they are simply beautiful and complex, the way that mathematical elegance is beautiful and complex, satisfying in ways that do not require external justification. All of these interpretations may be partially right. None of them can be confirmed. The makers are silent. The objects speak in a language whose vocabulary we can recognize without being able to translate. The same applies to the Iron Age practice of depositing objects in water. This is one of the most consistently documented patterns in British Iron Age archaeology, and one of the most mysterious. Rivers and lakes and bogs across Britain have yielded extraordinary concentrations of metalwork, weapons, cauldrons, ornaments, and everyday tools deposited in quantities that clearly go beyond accidental loss. The Thames alone has produced thousands of Iron Age objects. The rivers of East Anglia, the lochs of Scotland, the lakes of Wales have all yielded significant quantities of deliberately placed metalwork, going back well before the Iron Age and continuing through it. These are offerings. The word is almost certainly correct, even if its full meaning eludes us. Communities and individuals were taking objects of significant material value, objects that required skilled labor to produce and precious metal to make, and giving them to the water permanently. The act of deposition was an act of irreversible giving. You could not retrieve a sword thrown into the Thames at Battersea. It was gone, given, to whatever inhabited or animated or was the river, to whatever powers were understood to reside in the boundary between the human world and whatever lay beneath the reflective surface of the water. The scale of this practice is one of the clearest indicators of the seriousness of Iron Age religious life. A society that throws expensive and well-made objects into rivers and does not retrieve them is a society with strong convictions about the reality and importance of the powers that receive those objects. It is also a society with enough surplus production to be able to afford these losses. Permanent deposition of valuable metalwork is not a behavior pattern available to communities living at subsistence level. It requires material security, and it requires a theological framework in which the expenditure makes sense. We do not have that theological framework from the inside. We have the deposits spread across the landscape like a kind of devotional text written in bronze and iron and gold rather than words. And we have scattered Roman observations about British and Gaulish religious practice that describe sacred groves and bodies of water and the deposition of precious objects, confirming that what the archaeology shows was genuinely understood as religious practice by those who performed it. The Romans described the Druids as conducting human sacrifice, a claim that has been disputed and reinterpreted so many times that it is now impossible to evaluate with any confidence. What is not disputed is that the Iron Age in Britain and across the Celtic world practiced a form of ritual killing that left archaeological traces. The Lindo man, found in a Cheshire bog in 1984, was killed in the late Iron Age by a combination of a blow to the head, strangulation, and a cut throat. He was a well-nourished adult male whose nails and hands show no sign of heavy physical labor, suggesting he was not a slave or a laborer. He had eaten a final meal of flatbread and then been killed with considerable deliberateness before being deposited in the bog. Whether this was sacrifice in any theological sense, a ritual killing intended as an offering to a deity, an execution of a criminal or a prisoner of war, a killing carried out for some other purpose entirely, cannot be determined from the body itself. What can be determined is that the killing was deliberate and careful, and that the body was deposited in the bog rather than being buried or cremated in the way that Iron Age British communities usually treated their dead. The bog was a significant location, the liminal boundary between solid ground and water, between the living and the dead, between the human world and whatever was understood to lie beneath. Depositing a body in a bog was not the same thing as burying it or abandoning it. It was placing it somewhere. Lindoman is not alone. Bog bodies have been found across Britain and Ireland and northern Europe in significant numbers, and while many of them show clear signs of violent death, others do not. The bogs preserved not only the spectacularly murdered, but also the ordinarily dead. What they all share is the liminal location, the placement in the boundary zone between land and water. And what that consistency of placement tells us is that the bogs were understood as significant in a way that made them appropriate locations for certain kinds of deposition, human as well as metalwork, alive as well as dead. This is the Iron Age speaking to us in the only language it left behind. Not words, objects and places and the relationships between them. The ritual grammar of a society that understood the world differently from the way we understand it, and that expressed that understanding through action rather than inscription. The trade connections of Iron Age Britain deserve considerably more attention than they usually receive, because they reveal an island that was emphatically not isolated from the wider currents of the ancient world. Britain in the Iron Age was not a remote and barbaric island at the edge of the known world. It was a significant participant in European trade networks of considerable complexity, and the goods that moved through those networks connected it to the Mediterranean civilizations whose written records we have been relying on as our primary source for the period. The most visible evidence for this trade is the exotic material that appears in British Iron Age contexts. Mediterranean wine amphorae, glass vessels from the Eastern Mediterranean, silk that could only have come from China via a chain of intermediate exchanges, amber from the Baltic, coral from the Mediterranean, used as an inlay material in British metalwork as early as the 5th century BCE. None of these things could have arrived in Britain without sustained trading relationships extending across enormous distances. The wine trade is particularly revealing because wine was not simply a luxury commodity in Iron Age aristocratic society. It was a ritual substance associated with feasting practices that had deep social and religious significance. The great cauldrons and drinking vessels found in elite Iron Age burials across Britain and the continent were designed for the communal consumption of drink at feasts, where social hierarchy was performed and reinforced, where alliances were made and broken, where the distribution of honor through the gift of food and drink established and communicated the relative standing of host and guests. Importing wine was not just importing an expensive beverage. It was importing a substance that could be deployed in the most socially consequential settings of Iron Age elite life. The Mediterranean amphorae found at sites across southern Britain represent the physical evidence of this exchange. They came across the channel and up the rivers and along the trackways in quantities that imply a sustained trade of considerable volume by the late Iron Age. And they came in exchange for something. Britain was not acquiring Mediterranean luxury goods through charity. It was trading. And what it was trading, as far as the evidence suggests, was tin and cattle, and slaves, and hunting dogs, and possibly grain. Strabo, a Greek geographer writing around the turn of the Common Era, lists the British exports as grain, cattle, gold, silver, iron, hides, slaves, and hunting dogs. This is a list of primary products, raw materials, and livestock and human beings, traded for the manufactured goods and luxuries of the Mediterranean world. The slave trade is worth pausing on, because it appears in the ancient sources and in the archaeology, and it is not comfortable. Iron Age British society, in common with most societies in the ancient world, kept slaves and traded in human beings. Iron Age slave chains have been found in Britain, multiple pairs of neck rings connected by a long bar that would have kept a line of prisoners together. They are unambiguous. Iron Age British communities sold people to Mediterranean buyers, and the trade went in both directions, with slaves from defeated enemies exported south across the Channel in exchange for the wine and the glass and the bronze vessels that appear in elite British contexts. This is not a detail that the Romans made up to blacken the reputation of a people they were about to conquer. It appears in the archaeological record as physical equipment. It is one of the things the silence of the written record conceals. the mechanics of how Iron Age British society generated the surplus that supported its elite and maintained its trade relationships, which included, among its mechanisms, the capture and sale of human beings from defeated neighbouring communities. The coinage tells us something else about the late Iron Age that complicates the picture of a non-literate society. From roughly 200 BCE onwards, coins began to be produced in Britain by Iron Age communities, initially imitating Greek prototypes and then developing distinctive local styles. By the 1st century BCE, some of these coins bore names, the names of rulers or communities or minting authorities, in Greek or Latin letters. These are the first written texts produced in Britain by British hands that have survived. They are not literature, they are not history. They are, in the most minimal sense, writing, a name, sometimes a place name, on a small disc of gold or silver or bronze. But they are significant precisely because of their minimalism. Iron Age British elites of the late period whom were choosing to use writing for the most publicly visible of all objects. The coin that circulates in trade is seen by many hands. Putting a name on it in letters is a choice to use written language in a context where it would reach the maximum number of people. And yet, they wrote almost nothing else. The contrast is striking. Here is a society that knew what letters were, that used them on its coins, that was in regular contact with literate Mediterranean traders and diplomats, that had members of its elite who presumably could read at least enough to recognize names in script, and it still did not produce written texts in any form that has survived. Still relied on oral tradition for the preservation of knowledge that other societies in contact with it were committing to parchment and papyrus. Still chose, or perhaps found itself compelled by cultural tradition, to keep its most important knowledge in the memory of trained specialists, rather than in the permanent medium of writing. The Druids, in Caesar's account, explicitly chose not to write their knowledge down. He says this was a matter of principle, that they believed writing weakened memory, and that the discipline of memorization was itself valuable. That the act of holding thousands of lines of verse in the mind was not just a means of preserving information, but a practice that developed the intelligence and character of those who performed it. This is a coherent intellectual position. It is not the position of people who do not know that writing exists. It is the position of people who know that writing exists and have decided, for their own reasons, not to use it for their most important purposes. We are left with the possibility that the silence of Iron Age Britain is not an absence. It is a choice to preserve knowledge in a form that is inherently social, transmitted between teacher and student in direct personal relationship, dependent on the continuity of living communities rather than the durability of inscribed material. A choice whose consequences include the fact that when the communities were disrupted, first by Roman conquest and later by the political transformations of the post-Roman centuries, much of what they had preserved was lost. Not because it was never worth preserving, because the method of preservation was vulnerable to exactly the kind of catastrophic disruption that the Iron Age eventually experienced. The Yorkshire wolds in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE were doing something that nobody else in Britain was doing. They were burying their dead in wheeled vehicles. Not in the vehicles metaphorically, literally in them. The body was placed in the grave with a two-wheeled cart or chariot. Disassembled, the wheels laid flat beneath the body or leant against the sides of the burial pit. The iron tire hoops and bronze fittings arranged around the dead person with a care that suggests the relationship between a person and their vehicle was understood as something that needed to continue after death. These are the chariot burials of the Arras culture, named after a village in the East Riding of Yorkshire, where the first major cemetery was excavated in the 19th century. They are extraordinary by any measure. They represent a burial tradition that has no close parallel in Iron Age Britain, outside the Yorkshire region, but that has strong parallels in the chariot burials of the Latin-les culture in France and Switzerland and further east. This connection has been interpreted in various ways, as evidence of continental immigrants who settled in Yorkshire and maintained their burial traditions, as evidence of an elite in Yorkshire who adopted continental fashions to display their cosmopolitan connections as evidence of indigenous communities who transformed influences from abroad into something distinctively their own. The truth is probably the last of these because the Aris culture chariot burials, while they share a vocabulary with continental examples, are not simply copies of continental practice. They have their own characteristics, their own internal logic, their own regional identity. The joints of pork that accompany many of the burials, for instance, appear to be a specifically British practice that has no close parallel on the continent. The orientation of the bodies varies in ways that may reflect local beliefs about direction and the afterlife. These are people doing something that connects them to a wider world while remaining unmistakably themselves. The most elaborately furnished of the Yorkshire chariot burials is the Wetwang woman, found in 1984 at Wetwang Slack in the East Riding. She was buried in a chariot with a suite of grave goods that includes a bronze mirror and an iron pin and a decorated canister whose function is still debated. The quality of the metalwork is extraordinary. The bronze items show the same curvilinear artistry that appears on the great prestige objects from the Thames, translated into a funerary context where it would accompany a specific individual beyond death. She was someone of significance. What significance exactly? Queen or priestess or warrior or something else for which we have no ready category cannot be determined. But the investment in her burial makes clear that her community understood her death as an event requiring an extraordinary material response. She is one of the Iron Age's silent voices, present in the objects she was buried with, absent in any word she left behind. The north of Britain in the Iron Age presents a different set of silences and a different set of extraordinary things. Scotland in the Middle and Late Iron Age, from roughly 400 BCE onwards, was building structures that appear nowhere else in the ancient world. The brochs. A broch is a dry stone tower, circular in plan, with hollow walls of extraordinary structural sophistication. The best preserved example, Mouser Broch in Shetland, stands nearly 14 meters high today after 2,000 years of exposure to the most extreme weather in Britain, and it is taller now than most Iron Age buildings were when they were new. The inner face of the wall and the outer face of the wall are separate structures, connected at intervals by stone lintels that form internal galleries running around the interior of the tower at multiple levels. The result is a hollow wall that is both lighter than a solid wall of the same height and stronger, because the two shells brace each other against lateral movement, while the galleries provide internal structural support. This is sophisticated engineering, not the engineering of people who stumbled accidentally onto a workable form. The engineering of people who had thought carefully about how stone behaves under load, about what happens to a circular structure when wind pressure is applied unevenly, about how to maximize internal space while minimizing the use of the most labor-intensive material. The brochs represent a tradition of structural innovation that developed over several generations, with earlier, simpler examples of the form showing the working out of principles that later examples apply with complete confidence. There are over 500 brochs in Scotland, concentrated in the northern and western Isles and along the Atlantic coast of the mainland. Some of them occur in clusters that suggest they were built by communities with specific knowledge of the form, experts in broch construction who moved between projects in the way that we might imagine, specialist builders working in any period of history. Others are more isolated, suggesting that the tradition spread through some mechanism of knowledge transfer that we cannot reconstruct from the structures themselves. What were the brochs for? The most straightforward answer, and one that the evidence supports reasonably well, is that they were status symbols as much as they were defensive structures. A broch required an enormous investment of labor and skill to build. Its height made it visible for considerable distances. Inhabiting a broch was a declaration, similar in some ways to inhabiting a hill fort in the south, but more vertically expressed, more individually architecturally distinctive, more obviously the product of specific technical knowledge. Building a broch said, "I have the resources to command the labor and the skills that this required, and I have the connections to access knowledge of how to build it. The content of the brocks is difficult to read archaeologically because most of them were inhabited for long periods after the Iron Age, and their internal deposits are therefore complex palimpsests of many phases of occupation. But where Iron Age levels can be identified, they show communities of moderate size living in relatively comfortable circumstances, with evidence of mixed farming and craft production and the kind of domestic organization that implies stability and continuity. The brocks were not emergency refuges. They were homes, dramatically elaborated, built to be noticed, but homes. Scotland in this period was not in any meaningful sense unified. The island of Britain never was in the Iron Age. What we call Scotland was a mosaic of communities speaking different languages, some Celtic, some possibly pre-Celtic languages that have left almost no trace, following different religious and funerary practices, building different architectural forms, connected to each other and to the wider British and European world by networks of trade and kinship and occasional conflict that are very difficult to reconstruct from the available evidence. The Picts, who appear in the historical record in the 3rd century CE, and who were clearly present in Scotland long before they were first named by Roman writers, were not an Iron Age people in the usual sense of that term. They were a post-Roman development, or rather a community, that became visible in the written record only after the Romans had something to say about them. But their roots clearly extend back into the Iron Age, into the communities of northern Scotland, who built the brochs and buried their dead in ways different from the south, and developed artistic traditions, including the mysterious symbol stones that they would eventually produce, that suggest deep and distinctive cultural identities formed over many generations. The symbol stones are one of the most haunting puzzles of early British history, and they belong technically to the period after the Iron Age ends, but their visual language is rooted in Iron Age artistic traditions, and they speak to continuities that the traditional period boundary of 43 CE does not capture. These are large stones carved with symbols, combinations of abstract designs and stylized animals that appear with extraordinary consistency across a wide geographic area of northern Scotland. The symbols repeat: a crescent and V-rod, a double disc and Z-rod, a mirror, a comb, a fish, an eagle, a bear. They appear on stones that were clearly intended as monuments, placed in locations that suggest they marked territory or commemorated individuals or served some other public function. Nobody knows what they mean. The symbols clearly meant something consistent because the same combinations appear in multiple locations made by multiple hands. They are a communication system, but the key to that system was never written down, and the Pictish language in which it might have been explained is known to us only from place names and the names of individuals recorded in sources from other traditions. The symbols are a visual language without a translation, the most sustained silence in the entire record of early Britain. Wales in the Iron Age presents yet another set of distinctive characteristics that resist easy generalization. The upland communities of Wales built hillforts in significant numbers, and some of them, like Treasiri on the Lynn Peninsula in North Wales, are preserved in a state that allows a surprisingly intimate understanding of what Iron Age settlement life looked like. Treasiri, the town of giants in the Welsh folk tradition that encountered its ruins, sits at nearly 500 meters above sea level and preserves not just its outer defensive walls, but the footprints of over 150 stone roundhouses within those walls. This was a real town, a dense settlement of a type that contradicts the standard narrative of Iron Age Britain as a landscape of dispersed farmsteads. The Welsh landscape was also, like Scotland, home to communities whose relationship to the lowland south was mediated by geography in ways that preserved distinctive practices across long periods. The mountains of Wales functioned as a zone of relative protection from the kinds of political disruption that repeatedly swept through the more accessible lowlands, and communities in the uplands maintained traditions of settlement and practice that diverged significantly from the hillforts and open settlements of the south and east. The lakes of Wales were also significant ritual landscapes. Lynn Cerrig Bach on Anglesey, the island that became, in the Roman period, the most sacred site of Druidic Britain and the target of a specifically brutal Roman military campaign to extirpate Druidic practice, yielded an extraordinary assemblage of Iron Age metalwork in the 20th century when a wartime airfield was being constructed on the shore. The objects, which include weapons, cauldrons, vehicle fittings, slave chains, and items of personal ornament spanning a period of about 4 centuries, were clearly ritual deposits, thrown into the lake over many generations in the same pattern of devoted giving that characterizes water deposits across Iron Age Britain. The slave chains at Linserig Bach are disturbing in exactly the way they should be. They are beautifully made, the iron is worked to a high standard, and the design is practical and efficient. And they were used to bind human beings, who were then presumably transported as trade goods or used as labor. Their deposition in the lake alongside weapons and cauldrons suggests that they too had ritual significance in the context in which they were given to the water. What that significance was is impossible to recover. But the coexistence in the same deposit of objects we would classify as sacred and objects we would classify as instruments of oppression tells us something important about the complexity of Iron Age life, that neither the Romans nor the modern romanticization of Celtic culture fully captures. Religion in Iron Age Britain was not a separate domain from the rest of life. This is one of the things that the accumulated evidence of the period suggests most strongly. There was no Iron Age church, no institution set apart from daily life that one visited on specific occasions to perform religious duties and then left behind when returning to the secular world. The sacred and the practical were interwoven in ways that made the distinction we habitually draw between religious and non-religious activity almost meaningless in this context. Every significant act had a religious dimension. Entering and leaving settlements was marked by specific rituals. The boundaries of Iron Age settlements are frequently associated with deposits of animal bones, pottery, and human remains that suggest the act of crossing a boundary was understood as requiring some form of acknowledgement of the powers that governed that transition. Foundation deposits in buildings, objects placed deliberately in post holes or under floors at the time of construction, speak to a practice of investing physical structures with a sacred dimension through the act of making. The act of building a house was an act of creating a sacred space as much as a practical shelter, and the objects placed in its foundations were there to secure the protection or goodwill of whatever powers were understood to inhabit or oversee the domestic world. Animals were central to this religious life. Iron Age Britain practiced a form of animal sacrifice that is visible in the archaeology through the deposits of selected animal remains in specific contexts. Whole animals or carefully chosen parts, legs or skulls, or the remains of very young animals, placed in pits or at the edges of settlements or in the context associated with boundaries and transitions. The selection is deliberate and patterned in ways that must have meant something specific to the communities that made the deposits, though what exactly they meant cannot be determined from the physical evidence alone. Horse cult is particularly visible in the Iron Age British evidence. Horses were not primarily food animals for Iron Age communities, who had abundant cattle and sheep for that purpose. Horses were ridden and driven, used in warfare and probably in ceremonial contexts, and they appear in ritual deposits and in the iconography of the period with a frequency that suggests they occupied a symbolic position of considerable importance. The Great White Horse carved into the chalk at Uffington in Oxfordshire, which is now dated to the Bronze Age, but which was maintained and possibly recut through the Iron Age and long after, is the most dramatic visual expression of this horse symbolism, but it is far from alone. Horse imagery appears on coins and in metalwork and in the decoration of objects across the entire period. The landscape itself was sacred in Iron Age Britain in a way that makes a fundamental distinction between natural and constructed difficult to maintain. Springs and rivers and hills and specific rock formations were all understood as places where the power of the landscape was concentrated or accessible, and the practice of religious life involved engaging with those concentrations of power through specific actions at specific locations. The famous sacred groves, the nematon of ancient Celtic religious life, were natural spaces set apart for sacred purposes, defined by tradition and practice rather than by any physical construction, and therefore leaving no archaeological trace unless objects were deposited within them. This matters enormously for understanding why the Iron Age silence is not the same as the silence of a society that was doing nothing worth recording. The most important things in Iron Age British religious life may have been performed in places and in ways that left no permanent trace. The oral poetry preserved by the Druids, the ceremonies conducted in sacred groves, the songs and stories and cosmological teachings that gave Iron Age communities their understanding of who they were and where they came from and what the world was and how it worked, all of this was inherently ephemeral, inherently dependent on living human beings to preserve and transmit it. When the communities were disrupted, the transmission broke. What survived the Iron Age into the early medieval period was fragmentary and distorted by centuries of change, but it survived in the form of myth and legend and poetry in the Celtic languages of Wales and Ireland, which maintained literary traditions of extraordinary richness and which preserved, in transformed and often barely recognizable form, echoes of the beliefs and stories of the Iron Age people whose direct descendants they were. The Welsh Mabinogion and the Irish mythological cycles are not Iron Age documents. They are early medieval documents, but they contain material that almost certainly echoes Iron Age religious and cosmological ideas, transformed by centuries of transmission and the overlay of Christian culture, but not entirely erased. Reading those texts backwards into the Iron Age is a risky enterprise. The risks are well understood by scholars in the field, who are rightly cautious about extracting simple historical claims from material that has been through so many transformations. But the alternative, treating the written record as simply absent and the Iron Age as therefore unknowable in its religious and intellectual dimensions, is equally misleading. The oral traditions did not disappear without trace. They survived in fragments, transformed, embedded in later material, difficult to identify and interpret with confidence, but present, faintly, like a voice heard from a distance, through the intervening noise of centuries. The question of what Iron Age British women's lives looked like is one that the written sources handle with their characteristic distortions and the archaeology handles with its characteristic reticence and occasional startling directness. The Roman and Greek writers who mention British women do so almost entirely in the context of the famous exceptional figures, the warrior queens, the priestesses, the women who shocked Mediterranean observers by appearing in public contexts and exercising forms of authority that had no equivalent in the Roman social world. Boudica is the most famous of these, and we will come to her, but she was not the only woman in Iron Age Britain whose presence registered in the Roman record. And the persistent Roman surprise at British women's public roles is itself a form of evidence about how unusual those roles seemed to Mediterranean observers accustomed to a world in which elite women's lives were conducted primarily in private. The archaeology of Iron Age women is more complex than the written sources suggest. The burial record shows women across a wide range of social positions, from the lavishly furnished Wetwang woman with her chariot and her bronze mirror, to the much simpler burials of women whose grave goods were minimal or non-existent. This range reflects something about the range of women's social positions, rather than anything specific about gender as a category. Some Iron Age women had access to significant resources and status. Many did not. This is not surprising. It is what you would expect in a stratified society. What is more interesting is the evidence for specific roles. Female burials with items associated with textile production, spindle whorls and loom weights, and the bone tools used in spinning and weaving are extremely common across the period. Textile production in Iron Age Britain was not a marginal domestic activity. It was a major industry, both for local use and for export. Cloth was a significant commodity in prehistoric and ancient trade, and the scale of textile production, visible in the Iron Age archaeological record, implies substantial numbers of people engaged in it as a primary occupation. That those people were predominantly female is suggested by the burial evidence. Whether this reflected a cultural norm about gendered labor division, a choice, or some more complex set of arrangements is impossible to determine. Iron Age women also appear in contexts that complicate any simple narrative about gendered roles. Female burials with weapons are not common, but they exist, and they are not always easily explained as accidental inclusion or symbolic gesture. Some Iron Age women were buried with iron knives and spears in contexts that suggest these items had the same relationship to their owners that equivalent items in male burials had to theirs. Whether this reflects women who fought, women who had authority over warriors, women whose social roles cut across what we might expect from gendered categories, or something else entirely, is not possible to determine from the burial evidence alone. But it is present. The ironworking that gave the period its name is worth spending more time on, because the trajectory of iron technology in Britain across 700 years is one of the clearest examples of the kind of sustained intellectual development that the silence of the written record tends to obscure. People generally know that the Iron Age began when iron replaced bronze as the dominant working metal. Fewer people know that what happened to iron technology across the period of its use in Britain was a sustained program of technical improvement that produced, by the late Iron Age, ironworking of a quality that was not bettered in Britain until the medieval period. Early Iron Age ironworking in Britain was, by the standards of what came later, relatively crude. The iron was smelted in small shaft furnaces that produced bloom iron, a spongy, heterogeneous material that had to be repeatedly heated and hammered to consolidate it and expel the slag inclusions before it was workable. The resulting metal was of variable quality, with carbon content that was difficult to control and hardness that was inconsistent. The tools and weapons produced from early Iron Age iron were functional, often better than their bronze equivalents in terms of availability and durability, but not the products of a fully mature iron technology. By the Middle Iron Age, British smiths had developed techniques that addressed many of these limitations. They were producing iron with more consistent carbon content by controlling the atmospheres in their furnaces with greater precision. They were welding together iron of different carbon contents to create composite objects, like swords whose edges were deliberately carburized to achieve a hardness that the softer, more flexible core of the blade did not require. They were quenching and tempering iron to achieve specific combinations of hardness and toughness that a simply smelted and hammered iron could not produce. These are not simple discoveries. Understanding that heating iron in a reducing atmosphere increases its carbon content, and that this increased carbon content makes the metal harder but more brittle, and that the properties of the final object can therefore be controlled by managing the carbon content in different parts of it through different treatments, and that the final hardness achieved by quenching and the final toughness achieved by tempering can be adjusted by controlling the temperature and duration of those processes. All of this is a body of metallurgical knowledge that had to be built up experimentally over many generations. The smiths who held this knowledge in the Iron Age were specialists of the highest kind. Their knowledge was power, in the most literal sense. The ability to produce weapons of superior quality and tools of superior effectiveness was a direct contribution to the capacity of a community to defend itself and to work its land. The smith's position in Iron Age society was accordingly elevated, a fact that appears in the archaeological record in the burials of smiths, who are sometimes accompanied by their tools, a set of iron implements whose symbolic significance is suggested by the care with which they were placed, and in the treatment of smithing sites, which sometimes show evidence of having been treated with the same kind of ritual care that characterizes sacred locations. The association between smithing and the sacred is a persistent feature of Indo-European mythological traditions across many cultures and time periods. The smith who works with fire and metal, who transforms raw ore into objects of beauty and power, who understands processes that seem almost miraculous to those outside the craft, tends to occupy a liminal social position, both more and less than ordinary, connected to powers not available to everyone. Whether British Iron Age society held beliefs about smithing that corresponded to this wider pattern cannot be determined from the evidence, but the elevated status of the craft and the ritual treatment of smithing locations is consistent with it. Warfare in Iron Age Britain is something that the written sources dwell on at length and that the archaeology illuminates in ways that are both confirming and complicating. Caesar's account of his British campaigns describes chariot warfare of a type that clearly surprised the Roman army, whose experience of wheeled vehicles in battle was more limited than the Celtic world's. British warriors fought from chariots in the late Iron Age, using them not as platforms for fighting, but as rapid transport, to and from the battle line, dismounting to fight on foot, and then retreating to the chariot to regroup or pursue. It was an effective tactical system that required considerable skill from both the warrior and the charioteer, and the sophistication of the chariots found in late Iron Age British contexts, with their precisely fitted iron tyres and carefully balanced wheel construction, confirms that the technology was not improvised. The evidence for warfare in the archaeological record is both clearer and more complex than the literary sources suggest. The hillforts were clearly designed with defence in mind, and the elaboration of their defences across the period implies that attack was a real and regular threat. But the nature of Iron Age warfare in Britain, whether it was chronic low-level raiding, occasional large-scale conflict, or something in between, is difficult to determine. The skeletal evidence for violent death is present at some sites, like the Maiden Castle burial associated with the Roman conquest, but absent at many others. This does not mean those communities were peaceful. It may mean that their dead were not buried in ways that preserve the evidence, or that conflict in their regions took forms that left less direct skeletal evidence. The weapons of Iron Age Britain are themselves a form of evidence about the scale and nature of warfare. Iron swords of the late Iron Age could be over a metre long enough to be effective in mounted combat, or against opponents at a greater distance than the shorter swords of earlier periods. The best of them show sophisticated forging techniques that produced blades capable of taking and holding a sharp edge, while remaining flexible enough to withstand the stresses of combat without shattering. These were not ceremonial objects. They were functional weapons, well made and well maintained, and the communities that produced and used them were communities with real experience of what a weapon needed to do. The shields that accompanied these weapons, where they survive, are equally instructive. The Battersea shield, beautiful as it is, was not for fighting, but other Iron Age shields were. They were made of wood and leather, materials that do not survive well, and they are, therefore, less visible in the archaeological record than the metal weapons. But the wooden shield bosses and the bronze or iron fittings that reinforced them occasionally survive, and they show a construction designed to absorb and deflect the impact of weapons in ways that imply real experience of armed conflict. The social organization of warfare in Iron Age Britain was presumably connected to the warrior aristocracy that Caesar and other ancient sources describe. The prestige of martial activity is visible in the burial record, where weapons appear as grave goods in ways that suggest their significance extended well beyond their practical function. A sword buried with its owner was not simply equipment for use in another life. It was a statement about who that person had been in this one. It was the physical embodiment of a social identity, defined by the capacity for and the practice of armed violence in the service of the community. This is a world very different from the world of written records. It is a world in which identity is performed and displayed through action and object, rather than stated in text, in which the record of a person's life is preserved in the memories of those who knew them and in the physical evidence of how they were treated after death, not in a biography or an administrative document, in which the most important things about a person, their bravery, their skill, their generosity to their followers, their relationships to the powers that governed the world, are known to those who knew them and lost when those people, too, are gone. The Atlantic connections of Iron Age Britain deserve attention because they represent a dimension of the period that is often underemphasized in accounts that focus primarily on the relationship with the continent and with Rome. Britain was not only a North Sea and English Channel island, it was also an Atlantic island, with its western coast exposed to the ocean that connected it to Ireland and to the Iberian Peninsula and to the African coast beyond. The Atlantic Bronze Age, which had created a trading network linking communities from Morocco to Scandinavia along the Atlantic seaboard, was a predecessor to Iron Age trade connections that maintained some of the same roots and some of the same relationships. The connections between Iron Age Britain and Iron Age Ireland are particularly significant and particularly underexplored. The two islands are separated at their closest point by only about 20 kilometers of water, and the archaeological evidence for interaction between them across the Iron Age is substantial. Objects of Irish manufacture appear in British contexts and vice versa. Artistic traditions show shared elements that suggest either direct contact or common inheritance from shared ancestral traditions. The Latène art style that became dominant in Britain during the Middle Iron Age has strong Irish parallels, and some scholars have argued that Ireland may have played a more active role in the development of British Latène art than is commonly recognised. Latène is the term that archaeologists use for the later phase of Iron Age art and material culture, named after a site in Switzerland where a spectacular assemblage of votive metalwork was found in the 19th century. Latène culture, broadly understood, represents the floruit of the Celtic artistic tradition, the period when the swirling, complex curvilinear art that we associate with Celtic metalwork reached its highest development and most wide distribution. In Britain, Latène influence appears from roughly the 4th century BCA and becomes increasingly dominant through the 3rd and 2nd centuries, reshaping the material culture of the island in ways that connect it firmly to the wider Celtic world. But Latène in Britain was not simply imported from the continent. It was adapted and developed in ways that are distinctively British, and the development of the British Latène artistic tradition, particularly in metalwork, produced work that its continental counterparts recognized and valued. British Latène metalwork was traded back to the continent. British artistic innovations influenced continental practice. This was a two-way conversation, conducted in the language of objects rather than words, and Britain was a full participant in it, rather than a recipient of continental influence. The tribal identities of Iron Age Britain, which are known to us primarily through the names recorded by Roman writers in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, are a problematic category. The Romans named tribes in the way that conquerors name the communities they are dealing with, using political and military categories that may or may not have corresponded to how those communities understood their own identities. The Iceni of East Anglia, the Trinovantes of Essex, the Catovillani of Hertfordshire and Middlesex, the Brigantes of northern England. These are names in the Roman record, names given to communities whose own terms for their identity and affiliation we do not know. What the archaeological evidence suggests is that tribal territories, as the Romans understood them, may have been considerably less stable and less clearly bounded than the Roman account implies. Communities that appear in the Roman record as single coherent tribes may in fact have been loose confederations of more local units, where identity at the level of the valley or the watershed was more immediately significant to daily life than identity at the level of the tribe. The political structures that the Romans found when they arrived in 43 CE were, in many cases, relatively recent developments, the product of the political turbulence of the late Iron Age rather than stable ancient arrangements. The late Iron Age, from roughly 150 BCE to the conquest in 43 CE, was a period of significant political change in southeastern Britain in particular. New populations were arriving from the continent, bringing with them material culture of a distinctly Belgic character that is visible in the archaeology of several regions. Political authority was concentrating in ways that produced larger and more powerful political units than the fragmented landscape of the Middle Iron Age. Coinage was expanding its range and its sophistication. Oppida, large enclosed settlements that are architecturally distinct from the classic Iron Age hill fort, were being established in positions that suggest they were centers of production and trade rather than primarily defensive works. The Oppida are fascinating because they represent the closest thing to towns in the pre-Roman British landscape, and they appear at exactly the moment when British society was undergoing the political and economic changes that the Roman conquest would shortly interrupt and redirect. Camulodunum, the future Roman Colchester, was already a major enclosed settlement before the Romans arrived. Verulamium, the future Roman St. Albans, similarly. These were not places the Romans created from nothing. They were places the Romans took over, transforming existing centers of Iron Age power and trade into Roman towns while preserving their fundamental roles as focal points of the landscape. Understanding this pre-Roman context changes how you understand the Roman conquest. The Romans did not arrive in a wilderness and impose order on chaos. They arrived in a society that had its own order, its own hierarchy, its own centers of power and production, its own international connections. What the conquest did was redirect and transform those existing structures, channeling them into Roman forms, overlaying Roman institutions on Iron Age ones, replacing Iron Age elite authority with Roman authority, while often using the same individuals to exercise it. Boudica appears in the written record like a figure who has always been there, fully formed, her red hair and her terrible vengeance, and her chariot already fixed in the imagination of a civilization that has been telling her story for nearly 2,000 years. But before she was a figure in someone else's history, she was a queen of the Iceni, and before that, she was a woman in a society that the Romans who wrote about her understood only imperfectly and described only in the act of fighting them. The historical Boudica, to the extent that we can recover her from the accounts of Tacitus and Cassius Dio, who both describe her revolt in some detail but write a century or more after the events they describe, was the widow of Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, who died around 60 CE, having ruled under Roman client kingship for the 17 years since the conquest. Prasutagus had apparently believed, or been led to believe, that his arrangement with Rome was stable enough to survive his death, and he had accordingly made his will in a way that divided his kingdom between the Roman emperor and his two daughters, an arrangement that was intended to preserve at least partial Icenian independence under Roman overlordship. What happened instead is a matter of historical record in both Roman and archaeological evidence. The Romans treated Prasutagus's death as the end of client kingship and the beginning of direct Roman control. Roman officials moved into the Icenian territory and behaved in the way that Roman officials of the period frequently behaved in newly acquired territories. They confiscated property, they called in loans that Roman financiers had made to the Icenian aristocracy during the period of client kingship, and when Boudica protested this treatment, they flogged her and assaulted her daughters. The response to this was a revolt of exceptional scale and violence. The Iceni were joined by the Trinovantes of Essex, whose own grievances against Rome included the confiscation of their land for the colony at Camulodunum, and together these forces destroyed 3 Roman cities. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, was the first to fall, then Londinium, and then Verulamium, modern St. Albans. The destruction was so complete that a layer of burnt material, reddened and scorched, is still visible in the archaeological record of all 3 sites, a physical signature of a moment of fury that the landscape preserved even when the written record was imperfect. The death toll in the 3 cities is given by Tacitus as 70,000, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, but which points to something real. The revolt was catastrophic in its violence, and the people who were killed in the 3 cities were not primarily Roman soldiers. They were the Roman and Romano-British civilian population who had been living in those places, and whose deaths were an act of deliberate, targeted violence against the population that embodied Roman settlement in Britain. Boudica was eventually defeated in a pitched battle whose location is not certain, somewhere in the Midlands, against the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, who had been in the process of destroying the Druidic stronghold on Anglesey when the revolt began. The battle is described by Tacitus with an attention to dramatic detail that tells us more about Roman ideas of barbarian warfare than it does about what the battle actually looked like. What we know for certain is that the Romans won, that the revolt was crushed, and that Boudicca died, by suicide or by illness, shortly after the defeat. What we know less certainly is what Boudicca's own understanding of what she was doing was. Tacitus puts a speech in her mouth before the final battle, a speech that is, obviously, his composition, rather than her words, and that serves the literary purpose of demonstrating the nobility and legitimacy of the Icenian cause while making its defeat by a superior Roman force seem inevitable. The real Boudicca, the woman who made actual decisions in actual circumstances that led to the destruction of 3 cities and the deaths of tens of thousands of people, is behind the literary figure in a way that we cannot see past. She is the most visible individual from Iron Age Britain in the written record, and she is visible only through Roman eyes, in the moment of violent conflict with Rome. What she was like when she was not fighting Romans, what she believed, what the Iceni under her or Prasutagus' leadership thought about the world and their place in it, what traditions of governance and religion and artistic life they maintained. All of this is invisible. The silence swallows her along with everyone else. The Druids on Anglesey, the ones that Suetonius Paulinus was destroying when Boudicca rose in the east, appear in Tacitus's account in one of the most vivid passages in Roman writing about Britain. Tacitus describes the Roman army advancing on the island across the Menai Strait on boats and pontoons, and on the shore opposite them, standing a line of armed warriors interspersed with black-robed women with dishevelled hair holding torches, and behind them, the Druids raising their hands to the sky and calling down curses. The Romans were, Tacitus says, momentarily paralyzed by the strangeness of the sight. The screaming women and the cursing Druids froze the soldiers who were accustomed to the sight of armed enemies, but not to this particular combination of the terrible and the bizarre. Then the general urged them forward, reminding them that a soldier should not be deterred by a mob of fanatics, and they crossed, and they killed everyone on the shore, men and women both, and then they cut down the sacred groves. The cutting down of the sacred groves is the detail that matters most. Suetonius Paulinus went to Anglesey with the specific intention of destroying the Druidic institution on the island that was apparently its most important centre in Britain. The military campaign against Anglesey was not simply a campaign to pacify a resistant territory. It was an attack on a religious institution that Rome had identified as an enemy in a specific way, as the source of the ideological resistance to Roman rule that was maintaining opposition to the conquest across Britain. The Druids, Caesar had noted, had their most important centre in Britain, and students from Gaul came there to learn. By the time of the conquest, this probably referred to Anglesey, which occupied a central position in the maritime network connecting the Atlantic coast of Britain and Ireland, and which was surrounded by the sacred waters of the Menai Strait and the lakes of Anglesey that had received votive deposits for centuries. The Romans understood Anglesey as a problem, not primarily because of its military significance, but because of its religious and an ideological significance. Destroying it was an act of cultural destruction as well as military conquest. The groves that Suetonius Paulinus cut down on Anglesey had presumably been sacred for generations before Rome appeared on the horizon. They were the physical instantiation of the religious authority that the Druids exercised across Britain, the living symbols of a sacred landscape that gave the Druidic institution its power and its legitimacy. Cutting them down was intended to destroy that legitimacy, to make visible the power of Rome over the powers that the Druids claimed to represent. Whether it succeeded in its intended purpose is less clear than the account of the destruction itself. Druidic practice in some form survived the destruction of Anglesey, as the later Roman legislation specifically prohibiting Druidic practice implies that it continued to exist as a practice requiring prohibition. The Roman relationship with the religious life of Iron Age Britain is complicated by the fact that Rome generally tolerated the religious practices of conquered peoples, incorporating their deities into the Roman pantheon through a process of interpretatio Romana that identified native gods with their Roman equivalents and allowed both to be worshipped in the same temple. This happened in Britain too. The water goddess, Sulis, at the hot springs of Bath became Sulis Minerva. Nodons, at his great sanctuary at Lydney, in Gloucestershire, accumulated Roman architectural trappings while maintaining his distinctly British character. The sacred landscape of Roman Britain is full of hybrid deities and hybrid sanctuaries, where the Iron Age religious traditions and Roman ones coexisted and merged. The exception was the Druids, and the exception tells us something important. Rome had no objection to Celtic religious practice in general. It had a very specific objection to the Druids as an institution. This was, at least in part, a political objection. An institution with trans-tribal authority, capable of settling disputes between communities and of commanding compliance across political boundaries, was precisely the kind of institution that could organize resistance to Roman rule. The Druids were dangerous not because of their religion as such, but because their institutional authority was independent of and potentially superior to political authority, including Roman political authority. There may also have been religious reasons for Roman hostility. Caesar and others mention the practice of human sacrifice in connection with the Druids, and while the extent and nature of this practice is debated, it is at least possible that some forms of Druidic religious practice conflicted with Roman standards in ways that gave Rome an additional justification for its specifically targeted hostility. But the political explanation is sufficient, and the political explanation is the one most consistent with the pattern of Roman behavior across the province. The generation after the Boudican revolt saw significant changes in the relationship between Rome and the British communities under its rule. Suetonius Paulinus's brutal response to the revolt, burning and killing the communities that had supported Boudica after her defeat, was replaced by a more conciliatory policy under his successors, who understood that a policy of pure repression was likely to produce further revolts rather than stable submission. The client kingdoms that had existed in the first phase of the conquest, the arrangements with local rulers like Prasutagus that had allowed some degree of indigenous authority to persist under Roman overlordship, were replaced by direct Roman administration, but that administration made more effort to incorporate the existing Iron Age elite into its structures rather than simply displacing them. The response of that elite to Roman conquest was varied and is reflected in the archaeology. Some communities adopted Roman material culture with notable enthusiasm, building stone houses in the Roman style, commissioning mosaic floors, erecting bathhouses, using Roman tableware. Others maintained Iron Age traditions with much greater persistence, continuing to build in timber and continuing to use Iron Age ceramic traditions long after Roman alternatives were available. The pattern of adoption and resistance varied by region, by social class, by local history, and by a dozen other factors that are difficult to reconstruct. What changed most fundamentally and most irreversibly was the framework of knowledge preservation. The Druids, whatever their precise institutional fate after the Roman conquest, were no longer maintaining the oral tradition in the same way. The Roman education system, available to the children of the British elite, was a Latin language education system that did not engage with the content of the oral traditions that the Druids had preserved. The most important knowledge of Iron Age Britain, its poetry, its mythology, its cosmological teachings, its accumulated wisdom about the world as the Iron Age British had understood it, was not being taught in the new schools. It was not being written down. It was being maintained in fragments by people operating in an increasingly hostile environment for the kind of sustained community practice that oral tradition requires. This is where much of what Iron Age Britain knew was lost, not in a single catastrophic moment, not in a burning of libraries or a destruction of inscribed records, but in the slower, less visible process by which oral traditions decay when the communities that maintain them are disrupted, when the specialists who hold the knowledge are killed or dispersed or marginalized, when the young people who would have learned the tradition are educated instead in a different system with different content, when the social occasions that required the performance of the tradition, the feasts and the ceremonies and the gatherings, are replaced by different occasions that do not carry the same content. The loss was vast. We can infer its dimensions from the fragments that survived, mostly in Ireland and Wales, where Roman conquest never occurred or was much less complete, and where Celtic literary traditions therefore had longer and less interrupted histories of maintenance. What those traditions preserved in the mythology of Ireland and the poetry of medieval Wales is extraordinary and beautiful and clearly rooted in a much older world of belief and story. But it is fragmentary. The texts themselves acknowledge that they are preserving what remains of older traditions, not the traditions in their original fullness. Standing in a museum and looking at the Battersea Shield, or walking across the earthworks of Maiden Castle, or standing in the interior of Mauserbroch with its extraordinary walls rising around you, you are in the presence of a civilization that knew things and made things and lived lives of considerable richness and complexity and never told you directly a word of what those things were. The silence is not an accusation. It is a condition. And it is, once you have spent time with it, one of the most interesting things about the Iron Age, because it requires you to develop new ways of listening to objects, listening to the landscape, listening to the patterns in the archaeology that repeat across regions and across centuries, listening to the fragments of later traditions that carry the faint echo of older beliefs, listening to the analogies offered by other cultures in other places that preserved their oral traditions long enough to write them down, which may tell us something about the categories and concerns of cultures that did not. The Iron Age is not inaccessible. It is differently accessible from the periods that left written records. It requires different skills and different kinds of patience. It requires the willingness to accept uncertainty as a permanent condition, to say we think rather than we know, to hold the evidence loosely rather than constructing it into a narrative too confident, to acknowledge what it does not actually show. But the reward for that patience is access to 7 centuries of human life on an extraordinary island, lived with extraordinary intensity and creativity and seriousness, by people who would not have understood why their experience was less worth knowing about than the experience of people who happened to write things down. The roundhouse is the building that defines Iron Age domestic life in Britain, more completely than any other architectural form, not because it was the only form, but because it was the dominant one, found in virtually every region of the island across virtually the entire period, adapted to different environments and different building materials, but maintaining a consistency of plan and proportion that speaks to a shared understanding of what a house should be and how it should work. The Iron Age roundhouse was not a primitive dwelling. It was an evolved architectural form that had been refined over many centuries to suit the climate and resources of northern Atlantic Europe in ways that later rectangular structures did not immediately improve on. The circular plan distributed structural loads efficiently, allowing large internal spans without the need for internal columns that would have divided the living space. The conical thatched roof was designed to shed the heavy rainfall of the British Isles while insulating the interior against the cold in ways that the thin walls of a rectangular structure could not achieve on their own. The central hearth produced heat that rose naturally to the apex of the roof and escaped through the thatch without requiring a chimney, while smoking the thatch and the structural timbers against decay and creating a warm, dry, stratified interior atmosphere. Living in a well-built Iron Age roundhouse was not living in discomfort. Experimental reconstructions at places like the Butser Ancient Farm in Hampshire, where full-scale Iron Age buildings have been constructed using period-appropriate techniques and materials and then lived in and studied, have confirmed that the roundhouse was a genuinely effective building for the British climate. Warm in winter, cool in summer, resistant to damp, structurally sound against the winds that regularly hammer the British coastline, and adaptable in its interior organisation to the multiple uses that a single multi-purpose building had to serve. Those uses were many. The central hearth was the pivot of domestic life. Around it, food was cooked and warmth was maintained and light was provided, and the social activity of the household was organised. The radial structure of the interior, with the hearth at the centre and the walls of the building at the perimeter, meant that different zones of the interior could be used for different purposes without formal division: sleeping areas, work areas, storage areas, the stalling of animals in the coldest part of winter, All could coexist within the single circular space in a flexible arrangement that changed with the seasons and the needs of the household. The social architecture of the roundhouse was significant in ways that we can partially reconstruct. The doorway, which typically faced east or southeast to catch the morning sun, was the boundary between inside and outside, between the domestic and the wider world, and it was a meaningful boundary in Iron Age life, in a way that the foundation deposits associated with house construction make clear. The relationship between the left and right sides of the doorway, between the north and south halves of the interior, between the front of the house, near the door, and the back of the house, furthest from it, may all have carried symbolic meanings that governed the arrangement of activities and possessions within the interior. Some of the most interesting evidence for the social organization of roundhouse interiors comes from the spatial analysis of artifact distributions within well-preserved archaeological contexts. In some roundhouses, the material evidence suggests that different parts of the interior were consistently used for different purposes in ways that were patterned rather than random. Craft activities concentrated in better lit areas near the doorway, food storage in the cooler back sections, sleeping in specific quadrants. This kind of spatial organization implies shared understandings of how a house should be used that were transmitted socially and that had a meaningful relationship to the world outside the house. The feasting practices of Iron Age Britain are one of the aspects of the period that the literary sources and the archaeology illuminate most complementarily, each providing information that the other cannot. Caesar and others describe elaborate feasting customs among the Celtic peoples of Britain and Gaul, with specific seating arrangements that reflected social hierarchy and with protocols governing the distribution of the choicest portions of meat and drink that were socially consequential enough to spark violence when violated. The heroic feast, at which the right to the champion's portion was contested, is a theme in Irish literature that clearly reflects Iron Age reality in a way that the archaeology of feasting sites confirms. The archaeology of Iron Age feasting sites shows the physical evidence of consumption on a considerable scale. Large quantities of animal bone, dominated by cattle and pig in proportions that suggest feasting rather than everyday subsistence. Fine pottery and imported vessels that would have been used to serve food and drink in a way that communicated status. Structured deposits of feasting refuse in pits and ditches that suggest the disposal of the feast's remains was itself a ritualized activity, not casual rubbish disposal, but the meaningful ending of a significant social occasion. The cauldron is the central object of Iron Age feasting culture, in a way that goes beyond its practical function as a vessel for cooking and serving large quantities of food. The great Iron Age cauldrons, some of them of extraordinary size, capable of holding the entire carcass of a large animal in quantities of broth, were the center of the feast in both practical and symbolic terms. The stories preserved in Irish and Welsh tradition that invoke the magical cauldron of plenty, the vessel that feeds all and whose contents never run out, are almost certainly echoes of the Iron Age feasting cauldron's symbolic importance. The object that embodied the host's capacity to provide, to feed, to sustain the community that gathered around it. The deposition of cauldrons and drinking vessels in rivers and lakes is therefore not simply the disposal of valuable metalwork in sacred locations. It is the giving away of the very object that symbolized the ability to feast, the giving away of the power to sustain and bind a community. This is an act of deep symbolic renunciation, and it may have carried exactly that meaning. The feast in a world where feasting was politically and cosmologically significant. The giving away of the feast to the powers beneath the water. The permanent removal of the capacity to sustain community in the human world in favor of whatever sustained the powers of the other world. This is not the behavior of people doing things without reflection. This is a culture engaging in acts of extraordinary symbolic complexity, whose meaning we can only partially and tentatively reconstruct. The astronomical knowledge of Iron Age Britain is difficult to assess because almost none of it can be directly documented from the period itself. What we have are the monuments of the preceding period, the stone circles and long barrows and other megalithic structures whose astronomical alignments are demonstrable and significant. And we have the practices attributed to the Druids by the ancient sources, which include a concern with the celestial calendar that is consistent with what would be expected of a society in which the timing of agricultural activities and religious ceremonies was of fundamental importance. The Iron Age calendar that can be inferred from later Celtic traditions and from some ancient references is a calendar organized around the solar and lunar year in ways that divided the year into distinct periods with specific religious and practical significances. The festival of Samhain at the beginning of November, which survives in transformed form as Halloween, marked the beginning of the Celtic year and the time when the boundaries between the living and the dead were understood to be especially thin. Imbolc, at the beginning of February, marked the first signs of the return of fertility. Beltane, at the beginning of May, was associated with fire and the movement of cattle to summer pastures. Lugnasad, at the beginning of August, was a harvest festival associated with the god Lugh. These four great seasonal divisions, each one associated with specific practices and specific spiritual states and specific social obligations, were not simply agricultural markers. They were cosmological statements about the structure of time and the relationship between human life and the larger cycles of the natural world. They organized the year in a way that gave each period a character and a meaning and a set of requirements that governed what was appropriate to do and not to do. The calendar was a moral structure as well as a practical one. The association of these festivals with fire is particularly striking. Beltane specifically involved the lighting of large fires, and cattle were driven between two fires as they left for the summer pastures, a practice apparently intended to purify and protect them. Samhain was similarly associated with fire in later folk tradition. The fire festivals of the Celtic calendar connect the Iron Age British relationship with fire, visible in the central hearths of the roundhouses and the votive fires that the ancient sources describe at sacred sites, to a wider cosmological framework in which fire was understood as purifying and protective and connected to the powers that governed the world. Whether any of the stone circles and other megalithic monuments that survive from the Neolithic and Bronze Age were still actively used as religious sites in the Iron Age is uncertain. Some of them certainly continued to be significant locations, attracting deposits and activities that suggest ongoing veneration, even in the absence of construction. Stonehenge itself was the site of some Iron Age activity, though not on the scale of its Neolithic and Bronze Age use. Other monuments show similar patterns, maintained as significant places in the landscape, even when the specific practices associated with them had changed or been transformed. The Iron Age relationship with the prehistoric monuments of Britain is itself a subject of considerable interest. The people of the Iron Age were living in a landscape already ancient, already layered with the monuments and earthworks and field systems and place names of their predecessors. They could not have been unaware of these things. They walked past the stone circles and the burial mounds and the henges every day. Some of them clearly used these places. Some of them may have understood them in ways related to their original purpose. Others may have incorporated them into their own cosmological frameworks in ways that had no connection to their original meaning, but that gave them new significance in the Iron Age world. The long memories embedded in landscape are one of the things that oral traditions, at their best, maintain over very long periods. There is ethnographic evidence from Australia that oral traditions can preserve accurate information about specific landscape features for many thousands of years, maintaining memories of coastlines submerged by post-glacial sea level rise that can be verified by underwater archaeology. Whether the oral traditions of Iron Age Britain maintained anything comparable, knowledge of the meaning or history of the ancient monuments in the landscape cannot be determined, but the possibility is not negligible. The sea trade of Iron Age Britain extended further than the Mediterranean connections that the amphorae and the fine glassware and the Mediterranean wine make visible. It extended north and west as well, along the Atlantic routes that connected Britain to Ireland and to the Armorican coast of Brittany and to the Iberian Peninsula. The tin that made Bronze Age trade possible continued to move from Cornwall and Devon southward and eastward. The hunting dogs that Strabo mentions as a British export presumably travelled overland and by sea to markets that wanted them. The amber that appears in elite British contexts throughout the period came from the Baltic, an extraordinary distance away, by chains of exchange that moved it south and west across northern Europe. The movement of people along these routes was as significant as the movement of goods, though it is more difficult to track. The genetic evidence for the Iron Age population of Britain suggests that the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age saw movements of people from the continent that contributed substantially to the ancestry of the population. This is a revision of an older picture that saw British prehistory as primarily a story of cultural change rather than population movement, and it is still being refined as more ancient DNA data becomes available. What seems clear is that the Iron Age British population was itself the product of multiple waves of migration and mixture, not a stable, unchanging indigenous population. The diversity that resulted from this history of mixture is part of what makes the concept of a single Iron Age British identity problematic. The people of Iron Age Britain did not, as far as we can tell, have a collective name for themselves. They had tribal identities, regional identities, kinship identities, identities associated with specific landscapes and sacred places and ancestral lineages. The broader identity of being British in the sense of inhabiting the island of Britain was not, as far as the evidence suggests, a politically or culturally significant category for them. That identity was largely constructed by the Romans, who needed a name for the island they had conquered and chose Britannia, and by the later tradition that drew on Roman descriptions to create the idea of an ancient British people distinct from those who came after. The Celts are a similarly complicated category. The term Celtic is used by modern scholars to describe a family of related languages, of which the ancestors of modern Welsh and Irish and Scottish Gaelic are members, and by extension, to describe the material cultures associated with the peoples who spoke those languages. But the ancient sources never use the term Celtic to describe the inhabitants of Britain. Caesar uses the term Celtae for a specific Gaulish people, not as a generic descriptor for all the inhabitants of the Celtic language world. The modern use of Celtic as a descriptor for Iron Age British culture is a scholarly convention, not a self-designation by the people concerned. This matters because the concept of Celtic identity has accumulated a weight of romantic association that sits uncomfortably with the archaeological reality. Iron Age Britain was not a single Celtic culture. It was a mosaic of communities with varying degrees of connection to the wider Latine cultural world of the continent, sharing some traditions while maintaining others that were distinctly local, speaking related languages while differing in dialect and vocabulary, and possibly in the most important cultural content of those languages, and living lives that differed substantially across regions and across the 7 centuries of the period. The romantic image of the Celt, red-haired and fierce and spiritually exalted, is a product of the 18th and 19th centuries, shaped by specific cultural and political needs of those periods, rather than by the evidence of the Iron Age itself. The actual people of Iron Age Britain were probably as varied in their appearance and temperament as any large population across a diverse island, and they were almost certainly less interested in being Celts in any unified sense than in being Etzeni or Trinovantes or Dubunni or Silures or members of whatever more local community claimed their primary loyalty. Understanding this diversity and sitting with it, rather than resolving it into a simpler narrative, is part of what respectful engagement with the Iron Age requires. The people were complex. Their situation was complex. Their relationship to the silence they left behind is complex. And the meaning of that silence is complex in ways that continue to reward sustained attention. When the Roman army crossed the Thames in 43 and the conquest began in earnest, the world of Iron Age Britain did not end immediately. It ended slowly, unevenly, region by region, community by community, generation by generation, as the weight of Roman administration and Roman culture and Roman settlement transformed the island in ways that were impossible to fully resist. Some communities collaborated enthusiastically, some resisted violently. Most, probably, did what most people do under occupation. They adapted. They found ways to maintain what they could, while accommodating what they could remorse, not avoid. They dressed in Roman styles and ate from Roman pottery, while speaking Celtic languages in their homes. They worshipped at Roman temples that were, in some cases, built over Iron Age sacred sites. They served in the Roman army and brought back from distant parts of the empire experiences and objects and ideas that entered the local culture and changed it in ways that are still being traced. The transformation was real, but it was not total. The Iron Age did not simply end. It continued in transformed forms, in the material culture and the religious practices and the social organization of Roman Britain, and in the landscapes that Roman Britain inhabited, which were Iron Age landscapes shaped by Iron Age agriculture and Iron Age settlement patterns and Iron Age sacred geographies that the Roman grid of roads and towns was laid across rather than replacing, and then Rome left. In 410 CE, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing under the combined pressures of internal crisis and external invasion, and the Roman administration of Britain was effectively ended when the Emperor Honorius told the British cities to look to their own defense. What was left when Rome departed was a Romanized provincial society built on Iron Age foundations, facing an uncertain future without the institutional structures that had organized it for 4 centuries. What happened next, the sub-Roman period, the age of migrations and transformations, and the eventual emergence of the kingdoms of medieval Britain, is another silence, another period of sparse, written records and rich archaeology, another set of voices speaking through objects and landscapes rather than words. But that is a different story, and it belongs to a different night. Tonight belongs to the 7 centuries that came before. The 700 years of people who built Maiden Castle and threw the Battersea Shield into the Thames and buried the Wetwang woman in her chariot and raised the walls of Mouserbroch and cut the chalk horse into the hillside at Uffington and made music and feasted and fought and loved and died and preserved their knowledge in the only medium they trusted, the living, breathing, remembering human voice. They did not leave you words, they left you everything else. The rivers of Iron Age Britain were not what they are now. The Thames that flows through modern London, channeled and embanked and largely shorn of its natural course, was in the Iron Age a much wider, shallower, more complex river, braided in places into multiple channels, with extensive gravel bars and reed beds and marshy margins that blurred the boundary between water and land in exactly the way that Iron Age sacred geography required. The Iron Age Thames was less a river than an ecosystem, and the people who lived alongside it and deposited extraordinary things into it were living in relationship with something that was recognizably alive in its complexity and unpredictability in a way that the modern, managed river is not. This is true of most British rivers. The Witham, from which the great Iron Age shield found at Lincoln was recovered. The Ribble in Lancashire, rich in finds. The rivers of Wales and Scotland that have yielded significant assemblages of votive material. All of them were, in the Iron Age, more various and more vital than their modern equivalents, and the relationship between the communities living along them and the rivers themselves was a relationship of intimate dependency that shaped religious practice and cosmological belief in ways that we can see in the evidence, but not fully interpret. The concept of sacred rivers in the ancient world is well documented across many cultures. Rivers are liminal by nature. They are always in movement, always changing, always crossing from one territory to another. They rise from underground, from the mysterious world beneath the earth, and they flow toward the sea, toward the immensity beyond the known world. They carry things away and bring things in. They flood and they recede. They support life and they drown it. In almost every ancient culture that left records of its beliefs, rivers are among the most significant natural features of the sacred landscape, and the deities associated with them are among the most powerful and most frequently invoked. In Britain, the river deities whose names survive are almost entirely female. Sabrina is the goddess of the Severn, whose name survives into the medieval period in Geoffrey of Monmouth and who appears to be one of the oldest named deities in the British record, a name attached to the river before the Roman conquest and maintained through it. Verbeia is the goddess of the wharf in Yorkshire, known from a Roman period inscription, but presumably much older. The Thames itself may have had a deity whose name is lost, or may have been the deity itself rather than the home of a deity. The river as divine agent rather than divine domain. The femininity of British river deities is not accidental. In the cosmological framework that the evidence of the Iron Age and the comparative evidence of Celtic traditions elsewhere suggests, the earth and its waters were female in an absolute sense, not metaphorically, but actually, and the relationship between human communities and the landscape they inhabited was a relationship between people and a living female presence, whose favour was desirable and whose anger was to be avoided. The offerings thrown into rivers were offerings to the rivers themselves, gifts to the female power of moving water, and the expectation of reciprocity. Implicit in any gift relationship meant that giving to the river was a way of drawing its power into relationship with the human world. What the rivers gave back was life. Fish and wildfowl and drinking water and irrigation for agriculture and pathways for travel and trade and the mysterious underground connections between spring and river that made it possible to believe that water moving beneath the ground connected distant places in ways that human beings could not see but could infer. The springs that feed rivers were particularly significant sacred sites, places where the water of the underground world came to the surface and became available to the human world. Many of the most important Iron Age sacred sites in Britain are associated with springs, and many of these continued to be sacred through the Roman period and the Christian period into the medieval and even the modern era. The Great Spring at what is now Bath in Somerset was one of the most significant sacred sites in Iron Age Britain before it became one of the most elaborate Roman religious complexes in the province. The water that emerges at Bath is geothermally heated, rising from a depth of several kilometers at a temperature of approximately 45 degrees Celsius, and it emerges at a rate of over 1 million litres per day from a spring that has never stopped flowing in all of recorded history. In the Iron Age, before any structures were built around it, this hot spring must have been an extraordinary phenomenon, a source of warm water rising from the earth in all weathers, steaming in cold air, maintaining its flow through drought and flood, apparently coming from somewhere beneath the world rather than from the sky. The Iron Age deposits from Bath that predate the Roman development of the site are not elaborate, but they are present. Metalwork and other objects that were placed in the spring pool in the same pattern of devotional giving that characterizes Iron Age water deposits across Britain. The Romans arrived, recognized the site as one of exceptional religious importance, built a magnificent complex of baths and a temple to the goddess Sulis, who they identified with their own Minerva, and encouraged the continuation of the devotional practices that they found there, now expressed in the specifically Roman form of the curse tablet, lead sheets inscribed with appeals to the goddess to punish those who had wronged the depositor. The curse tablets from Bath, over 150 of which have been found in the sacred spring pool, are one of the most striking bodies of evidence from Roman Britain. They are personal, specific, sometimes petty, sometimes anguished, always human. People asking Sulis Minerva to recover stolen goods, to punish those who had wronged them, to bring illness or misfortune to named individuals. They are windows into the daily concerns of ordinary people in Roman Britain, concerns about theft and betrayal and injustice that are entirely recognizable across the distance of 2,000 years. But they are also evidence of continuity. The practice of depositing objects in the sacred spring was an Iron Age practice that the Romans inherited and adapted rather than replacing. The goddess who received the deposits was Sulis before she was Sulis Minerva, and the thermal spring that gave her power had been giving power for thousands of years before either Iron Age Britons or Romans came to worship there. the sacred landscape of Britain was not created by the Iron Age. The Iron Age inherited it and worked within it and contributed to it in ways that shaped what came after. The question of language in Iron Age Britain is both more interesting and more uncertain than it might appear. The languages spoken in Iron Age Britain were Celtic languages, which is to say they belonged to the family of Indo-European languages that spread across much of Europe during the Bronze Age and maintained their distinctiveness in the British Isles even as Latin replaced them on the continent. But the Celtic languages of Iron Age Britain were not uniform. They were a family of related languages, mutually intelligible in some cases and not in others, spoken in communities across the island with the same regional variation that you would expect in any language. Family distributed across a large and geographically diverse area. The two major branches of Celtic that survive today in the British Isles, Goidelish, which includes Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx, and Brittonic, which includes Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, represent the descendants of Iron Age languages that were distinct from each other in ways that are visible in their modern descendants. Brittonic was the language of the majority of Britain, with Goidelic spoken in Ireland and eventually in Western Scotland. Whether any pre-Celtic languages survived into the Iron Age in parts of Britain is uncertain and debated, but there are traces in the place name record of names that do not fit Celtic or Latin etymology, and may therefore reflect older languages whose speakers were absorbed into the Celtic linguistic world at some point before the Iron Age or during it. The Picts, as mentioned earlier, are the clearest case of a potentially pre-Celtic, or at least non-standard Celtic linguistic tradition in Iron Age and early medieval Britain. The inscriptions in Ogham script that some Pictish monuments carry, and the few other traces of what may be Pictish language that survive, do not resolve into any known Celtic language in a way that satisfies all linguists, and the possibility that the Picts, or at least some of them, spoke a language with a different heritage from the mainstream Celtic languages of Britain remains open. Language matters in this context because language is the medium of oral tradition, and the specific character of a language, its vocabulary, its grammatical structures, its phonological system, shapes what can be easily said in it and what cannot. The oral traditions of Iron Age Britain were encoded in Celtic languages, and the specific features of those languages, their capacity for elaborate rhyme and meter, their particular vocabulary for landscape and relationship and the sacred world, shaped the content of what was preserved in them. When those traditions were eventually written down in medieval Ireland and Wales, the languages in which they were recorded were the descendants of the languages in which they had been maintained orally for centuries. The encoding of the tradition in the specific character of the language was itself a form of preservation. The genetic evidence for Iron Age Britain is one of the most rapidly changing fields in the entire study of the period. Ancient DNA, extracted from Iron Age skeletal remains, has transformed the picture of British prehistory in the past decade in ways that continue to be revised and refined as more data becomes available. The broad picture that is emerging is that the Iron Age population of Britain was substantially the product of Bronze Age and Iron Age migrations from the continent, particularly from areas of Western Europe associated with the Bell-Beaker cultural complex of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, and that the population of the period was considerably more genetically diverse than the older model of a stable indigenous population implied. This does not mean that the people of Iron Age Britain were foreigners or immigrants in any meaningful social sense. The communities whose members were buried in Iron Age cemeteries across Britain were British communities, people who identified with specific landscapes and specific lineages and specific traditions, regardless of what their ancient DNA suggests about the origins of their ancestors. The genetic heritage of a population and the cultural identity of that population are not the same thing, and the attempt to map one onto the other has a troubled history that the most responsible researchers in the field are careful to avoid. What the genetic evidence does tell us is that the population of Britain in the Iron Age was, in deep ancestry terms, connected to continental European populations in ways that are visible in the genome, and that these connections were not simply prehistoric, extending back to the original settlements of the island, but included more recent Bronze Age and Iron Age movements of people that added new genetic lineages to the British population. This is consistent with the cultural evidence, which also shows regular contact and exchange with the continent across the entire period. Iron Age medicine is another area where the silence of the written record leaves us dependent on archaeological and comparative evidence. The Druids, in the sources that mention them, are associated with knowledge of plants and with healing, and the evidence from Iron Age context for the use of medicinal plants is consistent with this. Plant remains from Iron Age sites include species with documented medicinal properties, and some of the hoards of botanical material found in Iron Age contexts include combinations of plants that modern ethnobotanists recognize as medicinal combinations rather than dietary ones. Surgical skill in Iron Age Britain is documented by skeletal evidence that shows trepanation, the cutting of a hole in the skull, performed successfully enough that some patients survived and the bone healed. Trepanation was performed in many ancient cultures for various purposes: the relief of pressure from head injuries, the treatment of what may have been understood as possession by spirits, the creation of amulets from the removed bone disc. In Iron Age Britain, the evidence suggests it was performed on living patients who sometimes recovered, which implies considerable skill in the technique and knowledge sufficient to give patients a reasonable chance of survival from what is, even with modern surgical tools, a significant procedure. Healed fractures in Iron Age skeletons show that limb injuries were sometimes treated effectively, with broken bones set in ways that allowed healing in proper alignment rather than the crooked healing that results from no intervention. This too implies medical knowledge and practice, presumably held by specialists within the community, that extended well beyond the simply empirical. The silence around all of this medical knowledge is frustrating precisely because medicine is the area of human knowledge where continuity of practice is most directly visible in outcome. A medicine that does not work kills its patients. A medicine that works is preserved and transmitted to the next generation of practitioners. The Iron Age British communities whose members showed evidence of successful medical intervention were communities with working medical traditions, not guesswork. Those traditions were presumably maintained in the same oral tradition that maintained everything else Iron Age British communities knew, and they were presumably lost or transformed beyond recognition in the same way that the rest of the oral tradition was lost. Some elements of Iron Age British plant knowledge almost certainly survived the transition to the medieval period in the form of the extensive Welsh and Irish herbal traditions, which preserve knowledge of medicinal plants that is sometimes of considerable antiquity. The Welsh physician tradition of the medieval period, the physicians of Midfai, claimed ancient origins, and while the specific claims of continuity from the Iron Age cannot be verified, the knowledge base preserved in their texts includes material that is consistent with very old traditions of botanical medicine, rather than being entirely derived from the classical medical texts that were becoming available in medieval Europe. The animals of Iron Age Britain were not the animals of Britain today. The landscape in 800 BCE still harbored species that are now extinct or have been extirpated from the island. The wolf survived in Britain until the medieval period, but it was present in significant numbers in the Iron Age, large enough to be a real threat to livestock and occasionally to people. The bear survived in Britain until approximately the early medieval period and was present, if probably declining, in the Iron Age. The wild boar, that is a constant presence in Iron Age artistic traditions, carved in stone and depicted on metalwork and appearing in the animal assemblages of ritual deposits, was a common wild animal in Britain throughout the period, and Iron Age communities hunted it and perhaps maintained something of a cult relationship with it. The horse, as noted earlier, occupied a special place in Iron Age British symbolic life, but it was not only a symbolic animal. Iron Age Britain had horses in large numbers, bred and maintained, and traded with a care that the evidence of Iron Age horse burials and equestrian equipment suggests was taken very seriously. The The horses depicted on British Iron Age coins are among the most stylistically extraordinary images in the period's artistic record, abstracted and reimagined in ways that suggest not just representational depiction, but something closer to evocation, the capture of the essence of horseness rather than the likeness of a specific animal. The dog, too, was significant both practically and symbolically. Iron Age dogs were working animals, used in hunting and herding, and probably in warfare, and they were also companions in a sense that some burials make clear. Dog remains found in human graves, or human remains found in contexts associated with dog burials, in ways that suggest relationships of mutual significance rather than simple utility. The famous hunting dogs of Britain that appear in the ancient trade records were presumably a product of the careful breeding that is visible in the diversity of Iron Age dog remains, which show a range of body types suggesting deliberate selective breeding for different purposes. What does all of this add up to? 7 centuries of evidence that speaks through objects and landscapes and bodies and animal remains and plant residues and ancient DNA and the fragmentary testimony of outsiders who never fully understood what they were looking at. 7 centuries of human experience on an island that was, in many important respects, more sophisticated and more connected and more intellectually serious than the literary silence that surrounds it might suggest. The Iron Age British people were not waiting to be discovered by Rome. They were not in some pre-civilizational holding pattern, biding time until writing and cities arrived to make them real in the eyes of history. They were living their lives with full seriousness, maintaining complex and intellectually demanding traditions of knowledge and practice, building things of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication, engaging with the wider world through trade and cultural exchange and occasional conflict, and doing all of this without feeling the need to leave a written account of themselves for the benefit of people they could not have imagined would one day wonder about them. That wonderment is, in some sense, the most appropriate response. To stand in front of the great objects of the British Iron Age and feel wonder. Not the condescending wonder of a more advanced civilization encountering a simpler one, but the genuine wonder of recognizing sophistication and intelligence and seriousness in work that was made by people very like yourself, who looked out over much the same landscape you can see from the same hillsides, who felt the same rain and the same wind, who were afraid of the same dark and hungry for the same warmth, and who made, in response to all of that, things of such beauty that you are still looking at them 2,000 years later and not quite able to say why you cannot look away. The silence is not an absence. It is a different kind of presence. And the Iron Age is not a missing 700 years. It is 700 years that are present in every way, except the one we are most accustomed to looking for. Listen differently, and you can almost hear them. If you have stayed with this story through to its end, through all the hillforts and the bog bodies and the chariot burials and the cauldrons and the Druids and the sacred springs and the curvilinear bronze and the chalk horse and the great encompassing silence of 7 centuries without a written word, then you have spent some time in one of the most interesting and most underexplored periods in the long story of the island you may or may not call home. It has been, I hope, the kind of slow journey that makes the night feel more interesting rather than less. History at its best is not a list of facts to memorize. It is a way of entering imaginatively into lives very different from your own and finding, in the difference, something that speaks to the things that do not change. The need to make beautiful things, the desire to understand the world, the impulse to give what is most precious to the powers that are greater than any individual life, the knowledge that we are temporary, and the determination to be remembered somehow, even if only in the shape of a chalk horse cut into a hillside that nobody now alive can read the meaning of. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, the quiet, slow, deep kind, then you can let the algorithm know by leaving a like. If you want more nights like this one, following the evidence into the silences where written history does not reach, then subscribing will bring them to you. Leave a comment if you would like to, and tell me where you are right now and what the night looks like where you are. Someone is watching this in the light of an early morning somewhere in Australia. Someone is watching it in the middle of a long, quiet night somewhere in Canada. Someone is in a bedroom in Ireland, maybe close enough to an Iron Age hill fort that it is part of the view from their window. I read those comments, and they matter to me in a way that is, I think, continuous with what this is all about. All of us, separated by distance and time zones, and every difference that the world can impose, connected by the same story of people who were here before any of us and who left behind everything except words. For now, let the images settle. The chalk horse on the hillside, the bronze shield thrown into the dark water, the roundhouse firelight on the thatched rafters, the great banks of Maiden Castle seen from below, rising against a sky that has not changed since the people who built them looked up at it. The silence that is not empty, but full of 700 years of human life that is still here if you know how to look for it. The night is quiet. The Iron Age is close. Rest well. There is something that the archaeology of Iron Age Britain tells us about salt that seems, at first, to be a purely practical matter, but that opens, on examination, into one of the most revealing windows on the period's economic and social organization. Salt was, in the world before refrigeration, one of the most essential of all commodities. It preserved meat and fish against decay. It supplemented the diet at a physiological level, since the body requires sodium to function, and the Iron Age diet, rich in plant foods and low in the natural sodium content that meat provides in quantity, may have required supplementation. It could be traded over considerable distances because it is durable and easy to transport. And it was, in the Iron Age, as in many other periods of history, a significant source of wealth and a marker of access to resources that not all communities possessed equally. The production of salt in Iron Age Britain is documented in the archaeological record through a specific type of pottery vessel, known as very coarse ware, or VCW, that appears in large quantities at coastal and estuarine sites where salt was produced by evaporating seawater. These vessels were used in the production process as containers in which brine was evaporated over fires, and they are therefore concentrated in the locations where production happened rather than being evenly distributed across the landscape. The archaeology of Iron Age salt production in Britain is therefore a map of the salt industry, showing where production was concentrated and allowing inferences about how distribution worked. The scale of salt production visible in the evidence from sites like the Essex coast and the Somerset levels is considerable. These were not small-scale domestic operations producing salt for local consumption. They were industrial operations, producing salt in quantities that imply organized distribution to communities well beyond the immediate coastal area. The very coarse ware vessels themselves are not traded. They are production equipment rather than containers for the final product, but the presence of salt from these coastal sources at inland sites confirms that the product moved significant distances. Who controlled this salt production and distribution? The archaeology does not tell us directly, but the pattern of production at specific, apparently specialized sites suggests some form of organized management, rather than simply individual households producing for their own needs. Whether that management was in the hands of local elites who controlled access to the production sites, or whether it was a more communal arrangement, or whether specific communities had hereditary or traditional rights to particular salt production areas is impossible to determine from the physical evidence alone. What the salt trade tells us about the wider economy of Iron Age Britain is that specialized production and long-distance distribution were significant features of economic life well before the Romans arrived with their own economic structures. The idea that Iron Age Britain had no real economy, that exchange was purely local and goods rarely moved significant distances, is contradicted not only by the exotic imports, but by the movement of mundane but essential commodities, like salt, across the landscape. Iron Age Britain had supply chains. It had producer communities and consumer communities, and the mechanisms, presumably of trade or tribute or some combination, to connect them. The roads and trackways of Iron Age Britain are another aspect of the period's infrastructure that is poorly known but clearly significant. The Romans built their famous road network on an island that was not without existing routes, and some of those existing routes, the high ridgeway tracks that follow the lines of the chalk downs, the drove roads that moved livestock between seasonal pastures, the timber causeways across the Somerset levels, were clearly in use before the Roman conquest and continued to shape the pattern of movement after it. The ridgeway tracks of southern Britain are among the most ancient routes in the country. The ridgeway, which runs for approximately 85 miles along the chalk escarpment from Avebury in Wiltshire to Ivinghoe Beacon in Buckinghamshire, was clearly in use before the Iron Age, and the concentration of Iron Age hill forts and other sites along and near its route confirms that it remained a significant corridor of movement through the period. Routes along high ground had specific advantages in the Iron Age. They avoided the boggy and forested lowlands. They offered visibility, and therefore security, and they connected the hill forts that acted as the principal settlements of the period in southern Britain. The drove roads that connected upland summer pastures to lowland winter pastures were similarly ancient and similarly important. Iron Age animal husbandry involved the seasonal movement of livestock between different ecological zones, a practice known as transhumance that required established routes and the rites of passage along them that presumably had to be negotiated between communities whose territories the routes crossed. The drove roads are mostly invisible as individual features in the landscape because they were wide, earthen tracks used by many animals whose passage did not leave the kind of permanent mark that a constructed road does. But the pattern of landscape use that they imply is visible in other ways, in the location of watering points and enclosures and the distribution of animal bone at sites along the probable routes. Water was obviously the other great route in a period when rivers were the fastest and most reliable corridors for the movement of goods and people over significant distances. The Iron Age river network was used for trade and travel in ways that are documented in the distribution of find spots for traded goods, which tends to follow the river valleys rather than the overland routes in many parts of Britain. The rivers of the Thames Basin, the Severn and its tributaries, the great rivers of East Anglia, the rivers of Yorkshire, all of them were corridors of movement and communication that connected communities across the landscape. The boats and watercraft of Iron Age Britain are almost entirely invisible in the physical record because they were built of wood that does not survive in most conditions. A handful of logboats, simple dugout canoes, have been found in waterlogged contexts, but they represent only the most basic and least seaworthy form of Iron Age watercraft. The trade connections across the Channel, the evidence for regular movement of goods between Britain and the continent, require boats considerably more capable than a logboat, and the maritime technology of the period must have been more sophisticated than the surviving physical evidence suggests. Caesar, encountering British ships in 55 BCE, describes them as being well suited to the conditions of the open sea, a characterization consistent with the kind of vessel you would need to maintain regular trade across the Channel. The Irish Sea connections that are visible in the cultural similarities between Iron Age communities in Wales, Ireland, and Western Scotland imply a similarly capable maritime tradition operating in the Irish Sea, a body of water whose weather is, in some respects, more challenging than the English Channel. The ability to navigate those waters reliably, to maintain trading and social connections across them across multiple generations, required boats and navigational knowledge of a high order that is simply not visible in the physical record, because the materials it was made of did not survive. The pottery of Iron Age Britain is the most abundantly surviving category of material evidence from the period, and it is also one of the most regionally distinctive. Iron Age pottery in Britain is handmade rather than wheel-thrown for most of the period, which means that the specific traditions of vessel shape and decoration that different communities maintained were expressed directly in the physical properties of the pots rather than in the superimposed decoration applied to wheel-thrown forms. The way a potter shaped a vessel with her hands, the particular forms that her training had given her, the decorative traditions of her community expressed in the tools and techniques she used, all of this is encoded in the surviving pottery in ways that allow archaeologists to identify regional traditions and to trace the movement of people and ideas through the changing distributions of those traditions. The regional diversity of Iron Age pottery is extraordinary. The southern British tradition, in the heartland of the hillfort zone, developed through a sequence of styles from the early saucepan pots and furrowed bowls of the early Iron Age, through the increasingly elaborate decorated wares of the Middle Period, to the fine, wheel-thrown, often Gallo-Belgic influenced ceramics of the late Iron Age. The northern British tradition maintained quite different forms across the same period, with decoration that reflects different aesthetic priorities and production methods that correspond to different social uses. The Welsh tradition is again different. The Scottish tradition different again. Pottery is made and used and broken in the context of daily domestic life, and the domestic daily life of different Iron Age communities across Britain was different in ways that the pottery records. Different communities cooked different foods in different ways, served them in different types of vessels, and disposed of the broken remains in different ways that reflect different attitudes to the material world and its proper treatment. The archaeology of Iron Age pottery is not simply the archaeology of pots. It is the archaeology of daily life in all its regional and temporal variety. Childbirth and childhood in Iron Age Britain are almost invisible in the archaeological record, which is one of the most significant gaps in our understanding of the period. Infant and child mortality was high by modern standards, though the actual rates are difficult to determine, because infant burials are frequently not archaeologically visible, either because infants were buried in ways that leave little trace, or because their small bones survive less well than adult remains. What can be said is that Iron Age communities clearly invested in the survival and development of their children, since the elaborate child-rearing practices described in comparative ethnographic literature as characteristic of mobile small group societies, including the extended nursing, carrying, and close physical contact that keeps infants safe and promotes their development, would have been necessary in the Iron Age context as much as in any other. The transition from childhood to adult status in Iron Age society was presumably marked by specific ceremonies and rituals, as it is in virtually every human society. The coming-of-age ceremonies described in later Irish literature, which presumably reflect older traditions, involved tests of courage and physical endurance and the acquisition of specific skills and knowledge. The evidence for young men in Iron Age warrior context, depicted on metalwork and appearing in burial context with weapons, is consistent with a pattern in which the transition to adult male status was associated with the acquisition of martial identity and the equipment that expressed it. The education of Iron Age children was, as noted in connection with the Druids, an extended process of immersion in the oral traditions and practical knowledge of the community, conducted through apprenticeship and observation and participation, rather than formal instruction. By the time a young person was considered adult, they would have acquired an enormous body of practical and cultural knowledge: how to farm and how to hunt and how to make and repair tools, and how to navigate the social world of their community, and how to perform the religious duties expected of adults, and how to understand the world in the terms that their tradition provided. This was not a lesser education than a Roman literary education. It was a different education, oriented toward different goals, using different methods, and producing a different kind of person. Whether it was a better education in any absolute sense is a question that cannot be answered, partly because the terms of comparison are unclear, and partly because the goals of the two systems were genuinely different. Roman literary education was designed to produce participants in a literate, administrative, urban civilization. Iron Age Druidic and oral education was designed to produce participants in a mobile, oral, community-embedded civilization. Each produced what it was trying to produce, and each failed to produce what the other was designed to produce. The household economy of Iron Age Britain was a complex system in which agricultural production, craft production, exchange, and the management of relationships with neighbours and with the powers of the natural and supernatural world were all integrated in ways that a simple distinction between economic and religious activity does not capture. Farming was not simply a productive activity. It was also a set of practices embedded in a ritual calendar and subject to the requirements of relationships with the powers that governed fertility and weather and the behavior of animals and the growth of crops. The spring planting and the autumn harvest were events with religious as well as practical dimensions. The first fruits of any harvest were presumably dedicated in some way before being consumed, a practice consistent with the pattern of gift-giving to the powers of the world that characterizes Iron Age religious practice more broadly. The management of the land itself, the clearing of new ground for cultivation, the maintenance of field boundaries, the periodic decisions about which areas to farm and which to allow to regenerate, were all activities that had implications for the relationship between the human community and the landscape it inhabited. The landscape was not simply a resource to be exploited, it was a partner in a relationship that required careful management, and the consequences of mismanaging that relationship were visible in the form of failed harvests and damaged soil and the departure of animals from overhunted territories. This is not an Iron Age environmental philosophy in any formal sense. It is, rather, the practical wisdom of communities that depended directly and visibly on the health of the landscape they inhabited, and that had learned, over many generations, that certain forms of exploitation were self-defeating. The sustainable land management practices that are visible in the archaeology of Iron Age Britain, the rotation of crops, the management of woodland through coppicing, the maintenance of permanent pasture, the avoidance of soil exhaustion, were not the product of a formal environmental ethic, but of hard experience accumulated over centuries. The end of the Iron Age, conventionally placed at the Roman conquest of 43 CE, was not a single event. It was a process. Britain was not conquered all at once. The southeast submitted relatively quickly, partly because the political situation there had been transformed by 2 generations of Belgic immigration and the concentration of power in the hands of rulers who had already been negotiating with Rome. The southwest resisted longer. Wales was not effectively subdued until the late 1st century. CE Scotland was never conquered at all, the northern limits of effective Roman control fluctuating across the period of Roman occupation, but never extending to incorporate the communities that would become, in the post-Roman period, the Kingdom of the Picts and eventually the Kingdom of Scotland. This uneven conquest has implications for understanding what the Iron Age meant as a period. In the southeast, the Iron Age ended in 43 CE, more or less, as Roman institutions and Roman culture and the Roman economy rapidly transformed the landscape and the social order. In the north and west, the Iron Age continued in a modified form through and beyond the period of Roman occupation, and the cultural traditions of the Iron Age survived longer, maintained by communities that were not incorporated into the Roman provincial system. The communities of Highland Britain maintained Iron Age cultural forms in language and religious practice and material culture and social organization, well into the period that the lowland zone experienced as Roman Britain. And when Rome departed, it was partly those Highland communities and their traditions that shaped what Britain became next. The survival of Celtic languages in Wales and Scotland and Ireland, the survival of pre-Roman social structures in the Highlands, the survival of ancient sacred landscapes and their associated practices, all of these were the consequences of uneven conquest and the differential survival of Iron Age ways of life in the regions that Rome never fully dominated. Britain's Iron Age is in this sense not fully over. Its traces are present in the landscape, in the languages, in the place names, in the folk traditions, in the deep attachments to specific hills and rivers and springs that have persisted across all the transformations of the past 2,000 years. The chalk horse at Uffington has been maintained by the communities that lived in its site for 3,000 years, generation after generation, renewing the whiteness of the chalk against the encroachment of the turf, maintaining a monument whose original meaning has been entirely lost, but whose presence in the landscape has remained meaningful enough to justify the effort of its preservation through all the changes that time has brought. That continuity is itself a form of testimony, not a written testimony, not an explanation, but a commitment expressed in action rather than words, to the presence of something in the landscape that matters even when the reasons for its mattering have been forgotten. The Iron Age British people who first cut that horse into the chalk could not have imagined people speaking an entirely different language, maintaining their monument 3,000 years later. But they made something that outlasted them in ways that required active maintenance by those who came after. That is a kind of record, not the record that comes from writing, the record that comes from making things people cannot bring themselves to release, even when they can no longer say why. The way Iron Age British communities treated their dead is, along with the votive deposits in water, one of the richest and most complex aspects of the period's evidence, and it is one where the regional and temporal diversity of the period is expressed most clearly. There is no single Iron Age way of dealing with death in Britain. There are many ways, varying across regions and across the 7 centuries of the period, expressing a diversity of belief about what death was and what happened after it, that cannot be reduced to a single, coherent theological position. In the early Iron Age, from roughly 800 to 400 BCE, burial in many parts of southern Britain was not the dominant practice at all. The archaeological record for this period shows relatively few burials compared to the numbers of people who must have lived and died, and the absence of bodies is itself a kind of evidence. People were not simply being buried in ways that have not survived or that have not yet been found. They were being disposed of in ways that left no permanent physical trace. Excarnation, in which the body was exposed and allowed to be consumed by birds and animals, leaving only the bones, which were then scattered or deposited in ways that are archaeologically invisible or ambiguous. Deposition in rivers or bogs, where the body would decompose without leaving a recognizable burial. Cremation and the dispersal of ashes rather than their collection and burial. The choice of excarnation, or sky burial as it is sometimes called, is a practice with deep roots in British prehistory, visible in the Neolithic period in the treatment of bodies before their bones were deposited in communal tombs. The practice rests on a specific understanding of death, one in which the physical body is not the permanent home of whatever makes a person who they are, and in which the return of the body to the processes of the natural world, through decomposition and consumption, by other living things, is not a degradation, but a form of return, a reintegration into the living web of the landscape that is appropriate and right. The later Iron Age, from roughly 300 BCE onwards, shows a gradual shift in some regions toward individual inhumation burial, the direct burial of the body in a grave. This shift is not universal. Some communities maintained earlier practices much longer, others developed distinctly local burial traditions. But the increasing visibility of individual burials in the late Iron Age archaeological record suggests that a change in the understanding of the relationship between the individual person and their body was underway, possibly related to the increasing social complexity and the emergence of more individualized social identities that characterize the period. The funerary vehicles of the Arras culture in Yorkshire, the chariots and carts under which the dead were laid, are the most dramatic expression of this shift toward individual burial, and they connect the treatment of the dead to the social identity of the individual in a way that is very clear. Your vehicle, the thing that you rode or drove in life, the thing that expressed your status and your mobility and your relationship to the wider world, accompanies you into the ground. The boundary between life and death is not a boundary between having things and not having them. It is a threshold across which certain things, the things that most clearly defined who you were, accompany you. Caesar's account of the Druids' teaching about the soul is consistent with a view of death as a threshold rather than an ending, a transition to another form of existence rather than an end to existence. He says that the Druids believed that the soul did not perish at death but passed from one body to another, a belief that he connects, somewhat imprecisely, to the Greek doctrine of metempsychosis. Whether this accurately represents what the Druids taught, and whether what the Druids taught accurately represents what the wider population of Iron Age Britain believed, is uncertain. But the pattern of the burial evidence, with its careful provision of goods for the dead, and its treatment of death as a departure to somewhere, rather than simply an ending, is consistent with a belief in the continued existence of something beyond the physical life that the burial evidence records. The mirror burials are among the most haunting category of Iron Age grave goods in Britain. Highly polished bronze mirrors, whose reflective surfaces required extraordinary technical skill to produce, and whose decorative backs show some of the most complex and beautiful examples of British lateen art, appear in female burials across the late Iron Age. They are not common, they are restricted to a relatively small number of burials of apparently high-status women, but they are consistent enough as a category to be clearly significant. What the mirror meant in the context of burial is one of those questions that the silence of the Iron Age makes both urgent and unanswerable. The most obvious interpretation, that mirrors were personal possessions of their owners that accompanied them in death in the same way that other personal possessions did, is consistent with the evidence, but may not exhaust its meaning. Mirrors in many ancient cultures carried associations with the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds, between the surface of things and what lay beneath the surface, between the self and its reflection. The decorated backs of British Iron Age mirrors, with their complex swirling designs, could be read as cosmological diagrams as much as decorative surfaces, maps of the invisible world as much as backgrounds for a functional reflective surface. The women buried with mirrors were presumably people whose relationship to the powers of the invisible world was particularly significant, or whose social identity was particularly closely associated with whatever the mirror symbolized in the Iron Age belief system. Priestess is a category that suggests itself, though it is a category with modern and classical associations that may not map cleanly onto Iron Age British reality. Seeress, mediator, specialist in the kinds of knowledge that required access to the invisible world. These are possibilities that the evidence cannot confirm, but does not preclude. The invisible world of Iron Age belief, the world beneath the surface of the visible, beneath the ground and beneath the water, and accessible through specific altered states of consciousness and through specific ritual practices, is one of the most important features of the period's cosmological framework, and one of the most difficult to recover. What the Druids taught about the structure of reality, what the ritual specialists, whose roles are visible in burial contexts without being nameable, believed about the relationship between the world of daily life and whatever lay beyond it. What ordinary people understood about the forces that governed their lives and the powers that inhabited the landscape around them. All of this is preserved, if anywhere, only in the fragments of later tradition that may or may not reflect older beliefs. The landscape of Iron Age Britain was, in the experience of its inhabitants, a thoroughly inhabited landscape, not just inhabited by people and animals and plants, but inhabited by powers and presences that were as real as the material world and as significant to daily life. The springs had presences, the rivers had presences, the hilltops and the caves and the great ancient monuments left by earlier inhabitants had presences. The boundary between the land of the living and whatever land the dead went to was not a fixed and impassable barrier, but a permeable membrane through which communication was possible under the right conditions. This inhabited landscape was in one sense a more complex world than ours. More things in it required careful attention and respectful management. More of the events of daily life had implications beyond the immediately practical. But it was also, in another sense, a less lonely world. You were not navigating a neutral, indifferent universe. You were moving through a world full of presences that were interested in you, that had relationships with you, that could be cultivated or offended, and that responded to how you treated them. This is both more demanding and more reassuring than the universe of modern scientific materialism, and it is not surprising that it sustained human communities across many millennia in a way that more recent cosmological frameworks have yet to demonstrate they can match. The people who are invisible in the Iron Age record are the majority of its inhabitants. The great hillforts and the elaborate burial assemblages and the spectacular metalwork all speak primarily of elite experience. The experience of the majority of the Iron Age British population, the farmers and craftspeople and herders and fishermen and women who produced the food and the goods on which the elite and the ceremonial life of the period depended, is much less visible. The ordinary roundhouses, the small farmsteads outside the hillforts, the communities that left no rich burials and no prestige metalwork, are present in the archaeology, but at a lower resolution than the spectacular sites that attract the most attention. Trying to recover the experience of ordinary Iron Age people requires reading the archaeology at a different scale and with different questions. Not who was buried here and what did their grave goods say about their status, but how were these buildings arranged and what does that tell us about the organization of domestic space? What animals were being kept and how were they being managed? What crops were being grown and in what proportions? How much of the material from these sites was locally produced and how much was obtained through exchange? What evidence of craft production survives and how intensive was it? These questions are being asked with increasing sophistication by Iron Age archaeologists who have recognized that the spectacular sites are not representative of the period as a whole, and that understanding the majority of the population requires sustained attention to the ordinary. The results of this work are beginning to fill in the outlines of a picture of Iron Age life that is less dominated by elite experience and more attentive to the diversity of ways in which different people, in different communities, in different regions, across different periods of the 7 centuries, actually lived their lives. What that picture shows, in its outlines, is a population of considerable diversity living in a range of settlement types, from the large hill forts down through medium-sized enclosed settlements to small open farmsteads, with the majority of the population probably living in the smaller sites rather than in the spectacular hill forts that dominate the landscape and the historical imagination. Most Iron Age people in Britain lived in communities of tens rather than hundreds, in farmsteads of 2 or 3 or 4 roundhouses, surrounded by their fields and their enclosures for livestock, connected to their neighbours by the web of kinship and exchange and occasional conflict that characterized all pre-industrial rural societies. Their lives were physically demanding by modern standards. Agricultural work without machinery is exhausting, and the scale of the physical work visible in Iron Age skeletal evidence, particularly the patterns of muscle attachment that reflect habitual heavy labour, confirms that most people in the period worked hard with their bodies. But physically demanding work in a context where the body is well nourished and where the work has clear meaning, because it is directly connected to the survival of the worker and those they care for, is not the same as the exhausting and meaningless physical labour that industrial society produced in its worst moments. Iron Age agricultural work was hard, but it was comprehensible, embedded in social and ritual frameworks that gave it meaning beyond the purely productive. The question that hangs over everything about Iron Age Britain is the question of what was lost when the oral tradition that maintained its knowledge was disrupted. Not just the specific content, the stories and the cosmological teachings, and the medical knowledge and the astronomical observations and the legal traditions and the histories, all of which we can only partially and speculatively reconstruct from fragments, but the ways of thinking that the oral tradition embodied, the modes of understanding the world that the Druids and the bards and the other specialists who held and transmitted knowledge had developed over 7 centuries of sustained practice. Oral traditions at their best are not simply storage systems for information that could equally well be preserved in writing. They are modes of engagement with the world that are different from literate modes, different in ways that are not simply inferior to literate modes, but genuinely different, with different strengths and different limitations. Oral traditions maintain knowledge in forms that are inherently social and inherently performative, that require active engagement to preserve, that change and adapt in response to changing circumstances while maintaining cores of essential content. They produce different kinds of knowing, different relationships between knowledge and practice, different understandings of what it means to understand something. The loss of the Iron Age oral tradition was not, therefore, simply the loss of a body of information that could in principle be recovered if we found the right archaeological evidence. It was the loss of a mode of being in the world, a way of engaging with the landscape and with other people, and with time and with the powers that were understood to govern life. Some traces of that mode survive in the Celtic literary traditions of medieval Ireland and Wales, which preserved through writing some of the content that had been maintained orally, though in forms already transformed by centuries of change and by the overlay of Christian culture. But the mode itself, the living practice of maintaining and transmitting the tradition in its full complexity and its direct relationship to the landscape and the community, that is gone, or mostly gone. There are people today in the Celtic-speaking regions of the British Isles who are working to recover and maintain the threads of that tradition that have survived in the landscape and in the language and in the folk practices and in the literature. They are working against enormous odds in the context of a world that has been shaped for 2 millennia by literate, urban, industrial civilizations whose assumptions about what knowledge is and how it should be preserved and transmitted are fundamentally different from the assumptions that underlay the Iron Age oral tradition. But they are working, and perhaps that is the most hopeful thing to say about the Iron Age and its silence. The silence is not total. The tradition was not entirely destroyed. Fragments survive in unexpected places, in practices that have maintained themselves across long periods without anyone knowing quite why they persisted, in landscape features that have continued to be significant to the people living near them without the original significance being remembered, in the continued maintenance of the Uffington Whitehorse by generation after generation of people who may not have known why they were doing it, but who knew at some level that it needed to be done. The Iron Age is not over. It is incomplete, and the incompleteness is permanent. We will never recover the fullness of what was there. But what we have, the objects and the landscapes and the bodies and the fragments of tradition that have survived, is enough to make the period accessible in ways that the absence of written records cannot prevent. It requires different tools than the tools we use to read written history. It requires patience with uncertainty and willingness to sit with questions that cannot be fully answered. But it rewards that patience with access to a civilization of genuine depth and beauty, lived by people who deserve to be taken as seriously as any people who left written records. The 700 years are not missing. They are present, differently. And the silence, once you learn to listen to it, is one of the most eloquent things in the long story of this island. There is a particular quality to the light in southern Britain on a clear evening in late October, just before the festival, the Iron Age calendar called Samhain. The sun drops at an angle that makes the grasses glow, and the old earthworks cast long shadows across the hillsides, and the air has a coldness qualitatively different from other seasons. A cold with an edge of finality. The cold that says the growing year is over and the long darkness is beginning. You can feel, standing on a chalk ridge in that light, an awareness of seasonal transition that must have been far more immediate for people whose survival depended on what the seasons brought and took away. Iron Age people would have felt that shift in ways that are difficult for people insulated from the annual cycle by modern heating and artificial light to fully recover. The 4 great festivals of the Celtic calendar were not arbitrary divisions of the year. They corresponded to real transitions in the experience of living in a northern Atlantic climate, transitions that had practical consequences, that required specific preparations and specific responses, and that were accordingly significant enough to justify the social and ritual investment of major communal celebration. Samhain, the beginning of November by the modern calendar, marked the moment when the livestock that had been grazing on summer pastures were brought back to the winter settlements, and when decisions had to be made about which animals could be kept through the winter on stored fodder and which had to be slaughtered and preserved. It was a moment of accounting, a moment when the abundance or shortage of the summer's production became directly visible in the choices that had to be made about which animals to kill and which to keep. The meat from the autumn slaughter was preserved, salted, or smoked, or dried, to feed the community through the winter months when fresh food was scarce. It was also, in the cosmological understanding of Iron Age Britain, the moment when the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest, when the spirits of those who had died in the past year could most easily return to the places they had known in life, and when the powers of the other world were most accessible. The gathering of the living community for the Great Autumn Feast and the provision of offerings for the dead and the acknowledgement of the presence of powers that were usually invisible were all part of the same event, the community coming together to mark the threshold of winter and to do the ritual work that the threshold required. In bulk, at the beginning of February, was the festival of the first stirrings of the returning year, associated with the goddess Brigid, who was goddess of fire and poetry and smithcraft and healing, a combination of domains that reflects the importance of fire in all of these activities and the connection between creativity and the sacred in Iron Age belief. Imbolc fell at the point in the year when the ewes began to lactate in preparation for the birth of their lambs, a crucial event in the pastoral economy. That meant fresh food was becoming available again after the long winter. The greening of the grass after the winter was not simply a natural event. It was the return of the goddess, the return of fertility and warmth, and the possibility of life. Beltane, at the beginning of May, was the Great Fire Festival, the festival of the beginning of summer, when cattle were driven between fires and the community celebrated the full return of warmth and growth. The fires of Beltane were lit with new fire, kindled fresh from the friction of wood, rather than carried from an existing hearth, and all existing fires were extinguished and relit from it, a symbolic renewal of the life-sustaining technology on which Iron Age existence depended. The connection between fire and the life of the community was not metaphorical. Fire was literally what made food edible, what kept the cold at bay, what made the night safe and the smithy productive. Renewing it ritually at the turning point of the year was an acknowledgement of its centrality to everything that mattered. Lugnasad, at the beginning of August, was the harvest festival, the celebration of the first fruits of the agricultural year, named for the god Lugh, who in the mythology preserved in later Irish literature was the master of all crafts, the god of skill and competence, the deity who represented the full deployment of human capacity in the world. Lugnasad involved athletic games and competitions, markets and fairs, the settlement of disputes, and the formal celebration of the year's agricultural production. It was the great social gathering of the summer, the moment when communities that had been dispersed across their territories for the farming and herding season came together to mark the harvest and to renew the social bonds that held them together. These 4 festivals are not simply markers of the agricultural year. They are a cosmological framework, a way of understanding the passage of time as meaningful rather than merely sequential. Each festival marks a transition that is simultaneously practical and sacred, a moment when the human world and the world of the powers that govern it are particularly closely aligned, when the actions of the living community and the demands of the sacred calendar coincide in a way that requires a specific response. Living within this framework, as Iron Age communities did, meant experiencing time as rhythmically structured by meaning rather than simply as an undifferentiated flow from past to future. The night sky over Iron Age Britain, on a clear night away from any significant light source, was a different sky from the one visible from most modern British locations. Without the light pollution that now prevents the majority of the British population from seeing the Milky Way, the Iron Age night sky was dense with stars, the great river of the galaxy clearly visible, the planets moving against the fixed stars in their regular patterns, the moon cycling through its phases with a regularity that served as a clock and a calendar for communities without clocks or calendars in the modern sense. The Iron Age attention to the sky was practical as much as theological. The rising and setting of specific stars at specific times of year provided information about where you were in the agricultural calendar that was more reliable than weather-dependent observations of plant growth or animal behavior. The behavior of the moon, whose 18.6-year major standstill cycle was apparently known to the builders of Neolithic monuments like Callanish, and whose monthly cycle provided a reliable unit of time that could be counted and tracked without writing, was embedded in the structure of the Celtic calendar in ways that the Druids presumably maintained and taught. But the sky was not only a clock, it was also a text, a story written in light that the trained observer could read. The constellations had names and stories associated with them, mythological narratives that encoded information about the behavior of the stars and their relationship to the human world in memorable form. The planets, which moved against the fixed stars in regular but complex patterns, were presumably understood as agents with their own significance. Their positions at specific times of year or at specific moments of human life, carrying meaning for those who knew how to read them. None of this astronomical knowledge was written down by the people who held it. It was maintained in the same oral tradition that maintained everything else. And like everything else, it was partially preserved in the fragments of later Celtic literary tradition and partially lost in the disruption of the communities that had held it. The astronomical knowledge of the Iron Age British Druids is accessible to us, if at all, only through the monuments built by earlier peoples that the Druids presumably interpreted and used, and through scattered references in the ancient sources that confirm the existence of sophisticated celestial observation without providing its content. What endures from the Iron Age is not what endures from periods that left written records. What endures is physically substantial, materially present, built into the landscape, and embedded in the soil rather than preserved in the abstract medium of text. The hillforts on their ridges, the earthworks in their fields, the objects in the museums, the names of the rivers and some of the hills, in languages that go back to the Iron Age and earlier. The landscapes themselves, shaped by Iron Age agriculture and Iron Age settlement patterns in ways that are still visible in the field systems and the trackways and the distribution of settlements across the countryside. And the traditions, in fragments, in the Celtic literary traditions of the medieval period, in folk practices that have maintained themselves through all the transformations of the past 2 millennia, in the continued significance of specific landscape features, specific springs and hills and rivers that have never entirely lost the quality of being more than merely physical, that have continued to attract attention and devotion from people who may not have known why those places mattered, but who felt, as people in Britain have been feeling for at least 3,000 years, that they did. The Iron Age is a period that rewards investment. The more you know about it, the more clearly you can see the people behind the archaeological evidence. Not as simple figures in a simple story, but as complex, various, intelligent human beings living in a world that was richer and stranger and more sophisticated than the silence around it might suggest. You have spent several hours with them tonight, with the people who threw the Battersea Shield into the Thames and built the walls of Maiden Castle and raised the tower at Mauser and buried the Wetwang woman in her chariot and made the chalk horse and kept the fire burning in the roundhouse and gave the salmon to the river and watched the winter stars from the door of a settlement that is now only a scatter of earthworks in a field. They did not leave you their words, but they left you their world, shaped and marked and given meaning by everything they did. And if you look at this in the right light, at the right angle, with the right kind of patience, it still speaks clearly.